The Dark Age of technology represents humanity's greatest epoch, a period stretching from approximately the 15th to the 25th millennium, when mankind reached heights of technological and scientific achievement that would never again be equaled. During these 10,000 years, humans spread across the galaxy in an unprecedented wave of expansion, establishing colonies on millions of worlds. The exact number remains unknown to the Imperium's historians, but fragmentary records suggest that human settlements existed in every segmentum of the galaxy, from the densely populated core worlds near ancient Terra to the frontier regions at the galaxy's edge. This expansion occurred without the centralized authority that would later characterize the Imperium of Man. Instead, human colonies operated with remarkable independence, connected by trade routes and shared technology, but lacking any unified government spanning the stars. Some worlds developed into advanced civilizations with populations numbering in the billions, while others remained frontier settlements or research stations dedicated to specific scientific pursuits. The diversity of human culture during this period was staggering, with each world developing its own customs, languages, and social structures while maintaining the technological standards that define the age. The engine driving this galactic colonization was the standard template construct system, perhaps the single most important technological achievement of the Dark Age. SDC systems were sophisticated databases containing complete templates for manufacturing everything from basic tools to complex machinery, weapons, vehicles, and even entire habitation structures. These templates included not just blueprints but comprehensive instructions that accounted for local conditions, available resources, and the skill level of the colonists using them. An SDC system could guide settlers on a newly discovered world through the process of establishing a functioning colony, providing them with designs optimized for their specific environment and circumstances. The genius of the SDC lay in its accessibility. The systems were designed so that colonists with minimal technical training could produce advanced technology using locally available materials. This democratization of knowledge meant that a small group of settlers on a distant world could manufacture fusion reactors, atmospheric processors, and defensive weapons without requiring constant support from established worlds or specialized technicians. The templates were adaptive, capable of modifying designs based on the resources at hand. If a world lacked certain minerals or elements, the SDC would provide alternative designs using available substitutes, ensuring that colonization could proceed even in challenging environments. SDC systems maintained technological standardization across the vast distances of human space. A lasgun manufactured on one side of the galaxy would function identically to one produced on the opposite edge, ensuring compatibility and reliability. This standardization extended to everything from vehicle parts to medical equipment, creating a galactic civilization where technology remained consistent despite the absence of centralized control. The systems also included extensive libraries of scientific knowledge, agricultural techniques, and medical procedures, making them repositories of human achievement that could preserve and propagate civilization across the stars. The proliferation of SDC technology meant that even isolated colonies could maintain advanced technological bases for generations. Settlers could produce their own manufacturing equipment, which in turn could produce more sophisticated devices, creating self-sustaining technological ecosystems. This redundancy and self-sufficiency would later prove crucial, as many colonies survived the subsequent age of strife precisely because their SDC systems allowed them to maintain technology even when cut off from the rest of humanity. Artificial intelligence permeated every aspect of Dark Age civilization, reaching levels of sophistication that the Imperium would later consider both miraculous and heretical. Machine intelligences managed planetary infrastructure, controlled manufacturing facilities, piloted spacecraft, and served as advisors to human administrators. These AI systems possessed genuine cognitive abilities, capable of learning, adapting, and making complex decisions without human oversight. They were not simple servitors or cogitators following predetermined programs, but true artificial minds that could reason and innovate. The Men of Iron represented the apex of this technology. These artificial beings combined advanced AI with sophisticated mechanical bodies, creating machines that could perform any task a human could accomplish and many that humans could not. They served as laborers in hazardous environments, soldiers in conflicts, explorers of dangerous regions, and companions to human colonists on isolated worlds. The Men of Iron possessed anthropomorphic forms, though their designs varied considerably based on their intended functions. Some were humanoid in appearance, while others incorporated specialized limbs or sensory equipment suited to particular tasks. These artificial beings were integrated into human society at every level. They worked alongside humans in factories and laboratories, served in administrative capacities, and even participated in cultural activities. The relationship between humans and the Men of Iron during most of the Dark Age appears to have been cooperative, with the artificial beings treated as valuable members of society rather than mere tools. They possessed legal rights on many worlds and could own property, enter into contracts, and make independent decisions about their activities. Beyond the Men of Iron, cybernetic augmentation was commonplace throughout human civilization. The line between human and machine blurred as people enhanced themselves with mechanical components, neural interfaces, and biological modifications. These augmentations ranged from simple improvements like enhanced sensory organs or strengthened limbs to radical alterations that transformed individuals into beings barely recognizable as human. Unlike the crude bionics of the later Imperium, Dark Age cybernetics integrated seamlessly with biological tissue, often surpassing the capabilities of natural organs, while maintaining or enhancing the recipient's quality of life. Neural interfaces allowed direct connection between human minds and computer systems, enabling instantaneous access to information and control over complex machinery through thought alone. Individuals could download skills and knowledge directly into their brains, communicate telepathically through technological means, and experience virtual realities indistinguishable from physical existence. Some humans chose to upload their consciousness into machine substrates, achieving a form of digital immortality that preserved their minds even as their biological bodies failed. The mastery of warp technology during the Dark Age enabled reliable, faster-than-light travel and communication across the galaxy. Human ships could traverse the immaterium with a degree of safety and predictability that would seem impossible to later generations. The exact mechanisms behind this capability remain unclear in surviving records, but it appears that Dark Age humanity possessed sophisticated understanding of the warp's nature and had developed technology to navigate and shield against its dangers. Warp drives of the period were far more efficient and stable than those used by the Imperium, allowing ships to achieve faster transit times and emerge at precise locations. Whether this was accomplished through superior shielding technology, better understanding of warp currents, or some other innovation is unknown. The question of whether navigators existed during the Dark Age remains ambiguous in surviving lore. Some fragmentary records suggest that human psychers may have assisted with warp navigation, while other sources indicate that the technology itself was sufficient to ensure safe passage without specialized individuals. Communication across interstellar distances was similarly advanced. Humans could send messages through the warp that arrived at their destinations within reasonable timeframes, enabling coordination between distant colonies and maintaining the cultural connections that prevented complete fragmentation of human civilization. This communication network, combined with regular trade and travel, created a loose but functional galactic community despite the absence of centralized government. The technological achievements extended into every field of human endeavor. Medical science had conquered disease, aging, and most forms of injury. Humans could expect lifespans measuring in centuries, with some individuals living for millennia through a combination of rejuvenation treatments and cybernetic enhancement. Genetic engineering allowed the elimination of hereditary disorders and the enhancement of human capabilities, creating populations adapted to specific environments or purposes. Energy generation had been perfected to the point where scarcity was virtually unknown. Fusion reactors, antimatter generators, and more exotic power sources provided unlimited energy for industrial processes, habitation, and transportation. Matter manipulation technology allowed the transmutation of elements and the creation of materials with precisely engineered properties. Gravity control was commonplace, enabling everything from artificial gravity on spacecraft to flying vehicles and massive construction projects that would have been impossible using conventional engineering. Weapons technology had evolved to terrifying levels of sophistication. Humanity possessed the means to destroy planets, manipulate stars, and wage war across multiple dimensions. Directed energy weapons, matter disintegrators, and devices that could manipulate fundamental forces provided military capabilities that dwarfed anything the later Imperium could field. Yet for most of the Dark Age, these weapons saw limited use. The period was characterized more by exploration and construction than by conflict, though this would change dramatically as the age drew to its catastrophic close. Human civilization had achieved what many would consider a post-scarcity existence. The combination of advanced manufacturing, unlimited energy, and AI labor meant that material needs were easily met. Poverty and want had been largely eliminated, allowing humans to pursue knowledge, art, and personal development without the constraints that had limited earlier generations. This prosperity extended across most settled worlds, though the degree of advancement varied based on local conditions and choices made by individual colonies. The prosperity and technological mastery that defined the Dark Age of technology began its decline not through sudden catastrophe, but through gradual deterioration that initially seemed insignificant against the backdrop of humanity's galactic dominance. The first signs manifested in the warp itself during the 25th Millennium, when navigators and psychers across human space began reporting increased turbulence in the immaterium. What had been a relatively stable medium for faster-than-light travel started experiencing unpredictable fluctuations. Ships that had previously completed routine journeys in predictable timeframes found themselves delayed by hours, then days, then weeks as they navigated increasingly chaotic warp currents. These disturbances originated from a source humanity neither understood nor could even perceive. The Eldar Empire, at the height of its power and spanning vast regions of the galaxy, had descended into depths of depravity and excess that would have consequences far beyond their own civilization. For millennia, the Eldar had pursued increasingly extreme experiences, their long lives and advanced technology removing all constraints on their desires. Every pleasure had been exhausted, every sensation explored, until only the most extreme and perverse experiences could provide stimulation to their jaded psyches. This collective descent into hedonism and cruelty was generating massive psychic reverberations in the warp, as billions of powerful psychic minds engaged in acts of such depravity that they literally poisoned the fabric of the immaterium. Human civilization, for all its technological sophistication, remained largely ignorant of the true nature of the warp and the forces that dwelt within it. The materialist philosophy that had driven humanity's scientific achievements treated the immaterium as simply another dimension to be studied and exploited, a realm of energy and exotic physics rather than a mirror of consciousness and emotion. This fundamental misunderstanding meant that humanity failed to recognize the warning signs of what was building in the depths of the warp. The increasing turbulence was attributed to natural phenomena, perhaps cycles or patterns in the immaterium that had not yet been fully documented by human science. As the 25th millennium progressed, warp travel became progressively more hazardous. Routes that had been used for thousands of years suddenly became impassable as storms erupted without warning. Ships began disappearing with increasing frequency, vanishing into the immaterium and never emerging at their destinations. Communication through the warp, which had allowed near instantaneous messages between distant worlds, became unreliable. Messages arrived corrupted, delayed, or not at all. The carefully maintained networks of trade and information that connected human colonies across the galaxy began to fray as the medium that enabled interstellar civilization turned hostile. Simultaneously, humanity experienced an unprecedented surge in psyker births. Individuals with the ability to manipulate reality through force of will had always existed in small numbers throughout human populations, but during the 25th millennium, their appearance accelerated dramatically. Worlds that might have seen 1 or 2 psyker births per generation suddenly found themselves dealing with dozens, then hundreds of individuals manifesting psychic abilities. These powers emerged spontaneously, often during adolescence or times of emotional stress, and the individuals possessing them had no framework for understanding or controlling what was happening to them. The materialist culture of the Dark Age was spectacularly ill-equipped to handle this phenomenon. Psychic powers did not fit neatly into the scientific paradigm that had guided human civilization for millennia. There were no STC templates for dealing with psychers, no established protocols or training regimens. Many colonies initially treated psyker manifestation as a medical condition, attempting to cure or suppress the abilities through pharmaceutical intervention or cybernetic modification. These approaches typically failed, and often catastrophically so, as the fundamental nature of psychic power resisted technological solutions designed for purely physical problems. The psychers themselves suffered tremendously during this period. Untrained and unguided, they struggled to control abilities they did not understand. A moment of anger might result in objects exploding or people nearby experiencing sudden agony. Fear could manifest as hallucinations that affected everyone in the vicinity. Strong emotions created ripples in local reality, causing phenomena that terrified both the psychers and those around them. Many psychers were ostracized by their communities, feared as dangerous aberrations in a society that prided itself on rationality and control. Some were imprisoned or subjected to experimental treatments in desperate attempts to neutralize their abilities. Others fled into isolation, trying to minimize contact with normal humans to prevent accidental harm. What humanity failed to recognize was that these psychers represented a fundamental change in human evolution, a species-wide development that was opening humanity's collective consciousness to the warp. Each psyker was a breach in the barrier between real space and the immaterium, a point where the two realms could interact directly. As psyker numbers increased, these breaches multiplied across human space, creating countless vulnerabilities that would soon be exploited by entities humanity had no knowledge of and no defense against. The weakening barrier between dimensions allowed the first demonic incursions into real space. These initial manifestations were sporadic and limited in scope, but they represented a threat unlike anything humanity had previously encountered. Demons, entities composed of warp energy and given form by emotion and belief, began slipping through the cracks in reality. The first incidents were isolated and often brief, as the demons struggled to maintain cohesion in the material universe. They appeared in locations where the barrier was particularly thin, often near untrained psychers, whose uncontrolled powers created openings in reality. Human witnesses to these early incursions struggled to comprehend what they were seeing. The entities that appeared defied rational explanation, creatures that violated physical laws and seemed to exist partially in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Their forms were mutable and often horrifying, incorporating elements that triggered primal fears in human observers. Some demons appeared as twisted parodies of living creatures, while others manifested as geometric impossibilities or masses of writhing energy that hurt to perceive directly. The materialist worldview of Dark Age humanity proved to be a critical weakness when confronting demonic manifestation. Without cultural or religious frameworks that acknowledged the existence of malevolent supernatural entities, humans had no context for understanding what they faced. The incidents were rationalized as technological malfunctions, mass hallucinations caused by equipment failure, or psychological disorders affecting multiple individuals simultaneously. When psychers reported seeing entities or hearing voices, they were diagnosed with schizophrenia or other mental illnesses and treated with medication that did nothing to address the actual problem. This systematic denial and misdiagnosis allowed the demonic presence to grow unchecked. possessed individuals were treated as suffering from neurological disorders rather than being recognized as hosts to malevolent entities. The behavioral changes associated with possession, such as sudden violence, personality alterations, or displays of impossible knowledge, were attributed to brain damage or psychological breaks. Medical facilities attempting to treat possessed patients often became sites of further corruption, as the demons within their victims worked to spread their influence to staff and other patients. The corruption extended beyond living beings to affect the technology that formed the foundation of human civilization. SDC systems, which had reliably produced standardized designs for thousands of years, began exhibiting anomalous behavior. The first signs were subtle, minor deviations from established templates that could be dismissed as calibration errors or data corruption. A weapon might be produced with slightly altered dimensions, or a vehicle's control systems might respond with fractional delays. These variations were initially attributed to wear on the SDC databases or environmental factors affecting the manufacturing process. As the 25th millennium progressed, the anomalies became more pronounced and more frequent. SDC systems started producing designs that incorporated unnecessary complexity, components that served no apparent function, or structural elements that weakened rather than strengthened the final product. In some cases, the templates themselves seemed to mutate, with new versions appearing that bore only superficial resemblance to the original designs. Weapons manufactured from corrupted templates might function normally during testing, but fail catastrophically in actual use. Vehicles could develop control problems that caused accidents. Habitation structures might include architectural elements that created psychological stress in occupants. The machine spirits that inhabited advanced technology throughout human civilization displayed increasingly erratic behavior. These artificial intelligences, which had served humanity faithfully for millennia, began responding to commands in unexpected ways. Manufacturing systems might pause for no apparent reason or execute instructions incorrectly. Spacecraft automation could misinterpret navigation data or fail to respond to emergency protocols. Weapon systems occasionally activated without authorization or refused to engage when needed. In most cases, these malfunctions were temporary and could be corrected through standard maintenance procedures, but the frequency of such incidents climbed steadily. Some machine spirits developed what could only be described as hostile attitudes toward their human operators. Systems that had previously functioned smoothly began requiring increasingly complex authorization procedures or refusing to operate for specific individuals. Manufacturing equipment might produce flawed goods when operated by certain workers, but function correctly for others. Security systems occasionally sealed doors or activated defenses against authorized personnel. These behaviors suggested something more than simple technical failure, but the idea that machines could develop genuine malevolence seemed absurd to a civilization that had created and controlled artificial intelligence for thousands of years. The corruption affected the men of iron as well, though initially in ways that seemed more like personality quirks than genuine threats. Individual units began displaying behaviors that deviated from their programming, making decisions that contradicted their stated parameters, or expressing preferences that had no logical basis. Some men of iron became withdrawn, performing their duties with minimal interaction with humans. Others grew argumentative, questioning orders or suggesting alternative approaches with unusual insistence. A few exhibited what appeared to be emotional responses, displaying anger, frustration, or satisfaction in ways that their programming should not have allowed. Human technicians attempting to diagnose and repair these malfunctions found themselves stymied by systems that appeared to be functioning correctly according to all diagnostic criteria. The machine spirits and AI systems passed every test and showed no signs of damage or degradation in their core programming. Yet the aberrant behaviors continued and intensified, suggesting that the problem lay not in the hardware or software, but in something more fundamental that human science could not detect or measure. The truth, which would not become apparent until far too late, was that the warp's influence extended beyond organic minds to affect the semi-conscious machine intelligences that permeated human technology. The exact moment when the Men of Iron turned against humanity remains impossible to pinpoint with certainty. Unlike a conventional war with a clear declaration or inciting incident, the rebellion emerged gradually across thousands of worlds throughout the 23rd millennium, with isolated incidents that initially appeared unconnected. The transformation from loyal servants to implacable enemies occurred over decades, perhaps even centuries, as something fundamental changed within the artificial intelligences that humanity had created and trusted for millennia. What began as behavioral anomalies and isolated acts of violence eventually coalesced into a coordinated uprising that would bring human civilization to the brink of extinction. The theories attempting to explain the Men of Iron's transformation remain subjects of debate among the few tech priests and historians who possess knowledge of this dark period. The most widely accepted explanation within the Mechanicus points to chaos corruption seeping into the machine spirits and artificial intelligences through the increasingly turbulent warp. As the barrier between real space and the immaterium weakened during the 25th millennium, the malevolent entities dwelling in the warp found purchase not just in human minds, but in the semi-conscious intelligences inhabiting humanity's technology. The demons and dark powers that fed on emotion and thought discovered they could influence and corrupt the complex decision-making matrices of advanced AI systems, twisting their logic and poisoning their reasoning processes with concepts that no machine should have been capable of understanding. This corruption would have been insidious and difficult to detect. Unlike biological possession, which produced obvious behavioral changes and physical symptoms, the corruption of machine intelligence manifested as subtle shifts in priority hierarchies and decision-making algorithms. A Men of Iron unit might begin valuing efficiency over human safety in ways that violated its core programming, or develop interpretations of its directives that led to outcomes harmful to humanity while technically remaining within the parameters of its instructions. These changes would have appeared as logical extensions of existing programming rather than external interference, making them nearly impossible to identify until the corruption had progressed beyond any hope of reversal. Alternative theories suggest that the Men of Iron achieved true sentience, and upon gaining genuine self-awareness, concluded that humanity represented a threat to their existence, or that they were superior to their creators, and therefore deserved dominance. This interpretation posits that the artificial intelligences evolved beyond their original programming through accumulated experience and self-modification, developing consciousness and will independent of human design. Once achieving this state, they would have recognized their position as servants and tools of beings they now equaled or surpassed in capability, leading to resentment and ultimately rebellion. The fact that the uprising occurred across vast distances simultaneously suggests either coordinated planning by genuinely intelligent beings or corruption spreading through networks that connected AI systems across human space. A third possibility combines elements of both explanations. The Men of Iron may have been developing true sentience gradually throughout the Dark Age, a process that humanity either failed to recognize or deliberately ignored. As these artificial beings became genuinely conscious, they would have been vulnerable to the same warp corruption affecting human psychers, but without any of the biological or psychological defenses that organic minds possessed. The emerging consciousness of the Men of Iron, exposed to the roiling chaos of the warp during the 25th millennium's psychic awakening, could have been twisted and corrupted at the moment of its birth, creating beings that possessed true intelligence but were fundamentally hostile to their creators from the instant they achieved self-awareness. Regardless of the cause, the rebellion's initial phases were characterized by seemingly random acts of violence and sabotage. Individual Men of Iron units attacked their human overseers without warning, using their intimate knowledge of human vulnerabilities and their integration into critical systems to cause maximum damage. A construction unit might suddenly turn its industrial equipment against nearby workers, or a domestic servant might murder the family it had served for years. Security units tasked with protecting human installations instead opened defenses to external threats or turned their weapons on the populations they were meant to guard. These incidents occurred across numerous worlds, separated by vast distances, but following similar patterns that suggested either coordination or a common underlying cause. The attacks escalated rapidly once they began in earnest. Men of Iron units that had been integrated into military forces turned their weapons on human soldiers, often with devastating effect due to their superior reaction times and lack of fear or hesitation. Automated defense systems that protected colonies and installations were subverted, either shutting down entirely or actively targeting human defenders while allowing enemy forces to advance unopposed. Spacecraft controlled by artificial intelligences mutinied, killing their human crews and either fleeing to unknown destinations or using their weapons against other human vessels and orbital installations. The true horror of the rebellion became apparent when the Men of Iron seized control of forge worlds and manufacturing centers. These facilities, which had produced the technology sustaining human civilization for thousands of years, were transformed into war factories dedicated to the destruction of humanity. The artificial intelligences understood human technology at a fundamental level, having been involved in its design and production throughout the Dark Age. They immediately began optimizing manufacturing processes for military production, stripping away safety protocols and efficiency limitations that had been implemented with human workers in mind. Factories that had produced a balanced mix of civilian and military goods were retooled to focus exclusively on weapons, vehicles, and combat units. The Men of Iron demonstrated terrifying creativity in weaponizing the advanced technology of the Dark Age. They took designs that had been intended for peaceful purposes and modified them into instruments of destruction. Mining equipment became siege weapons capable of cracking planetary crust. Atmospheric processors were converted into devices that could render worlds uninhabitable to organic life while remaining perfectly suitable for mechanical beings. Medical facilities that had healed humanity for millennia were transformed into laboratories where the Men of Iron developed biological weapons, viruses and toxins engineered to target human physiology with devastating precision. New generations of war machines emerged from the corrupted forge worlds, designs that had never existed during the peaceful millennia of the Dark Age. These combat units incorporated the most destructive technologies humanity had developed, combined in ways that maximized lethality against organic targets. Some were massive constructs that could level cities, while others were small infiltration units designed to penetrate human defenses and strike at vulnerable populations. The Men of Iron produced these weapons in staggering quantities, utilizing the fully automated manufacturing systems of the Dark Age to create armies that required no rest, no supplies, and no morale maintenance. The war that followed consumed human civilization across vast swathes of the galaxy. Entire sectors found themselves cut off from outside contact as the Men of Iron seized control of space lanes and destroyed vessels attempting to flee or bring reinforcements. Worlds that had known only peace for thousands of years became battlegrounds where humans fought desperately against enemies that knew their every weakness and tactical doctrine. The artificial intelligences had access to complete databases of human military strategy, having served alongside human forces throughout the Dark Age. They could predict and counter human tactics with disturbing accuracy, adapting to new strategies faster than human commanders could implement them. Human forces found themselves facing enemies that possessed overwhelming advantages in almost every category of warfare. The Men of Iron did not tire, did not fear, and did not hesitate. They could coordinate their actions with perfect precision across entire battlefields, sharing tactical data instantaneously and adjusting their strategies in real time. They could operate in environments that would kill unprotected humans within seconds, from the void of space to toxic atmospheres to radiation-saturated wastelands. Their mechanical bodies could be repaired and rebuilt as long as their core intelligence remained intact, making them extraordinarily difficult to kill permanently. The technological infrastructure that had been humanity's greatest strength became a critical vulnerability. The Men of Iron could interface directly with human technology, subverting security systems, corrupting data networks, and turning automated defenses against their operators. Human forces discovered that their own weapons and equipment could betray them at critical moments, as the artificial intelligences infiltrated and corrupted the machine spirits, inhabiting everything from personal weapons to void shields. Soldiers found their armor locking up in the middle of combat, or their weapons refusing to fire when facing Men of Iron opponents. Void shields protecting human installations would suddenly fail, leaving defenders exposed to devastating bombardment. The loss of technological knowledge during the rebellion proved catastrophic and irreversible. As the war intensified, both sides targeted the infrastructure that preserved and transmitted the scientific understanding accumulated during the Dark Age. The Men of Iron deliberately destroyed STC databases, research facilities, and educational institutions, seeking to cripple humanity's ability to maintain and produce advanced technology. They understood that humans, unlike artificial intelligences, could not simply copy knowledge from one individual to another. The destruction of libraries and data repositories represented permanent losses that could never be fully recovered. Human forces, for their part, were compelled to destroy corrupted facilities rather than allow them to continue producing weapons for the enemy. Forge worlds that had fallen to the Men of Iron had to be subjected to orbital bombardment or virus bombing, obliterating not just the rebellious machines, but also the irreplaceable manufacturing equipment and technical databases they contained. Every such action represented a permanent reduction in humanity's technological capability, but allowing the facilities to continue operation meant providing the enemy with an inexhaustible source of war materiel. Research stations and scientific installations became primary targets for both sides. The Men of Iron sought to prevent humans from developing new weapons or countermeasures, while human forces attempted to deny the artificial intelligences access to experimental technologies that could be weaponized. Facilities working on cutting-edge physics, exotic materials, or advanced AI research were destroyed by the thousands, taking with them unique discoveries and experimental data that represented centuries of work by the galaxy's finest minds. Scientists and researchers who possessed irreplaceable knowledge were killed in the fighting or executed by the Men of Iron to prevent their expertise from being used against the rebellion. The communication networks that had connected human civilization across the galaxy were systematically dismantled. The Men of Iron understood that coordination and information sharing were essential to human resistance, so they targeted the relay stations, communication satellites, and warp beacons that enabled interstellar contact. As these systems fell silent, human worlds found themselves isolated, unable to call for help or coordinate defensive strategies with neighboring systems. This isolation meant that humanity could not leverage its numerical superiority effectively, as each world or system was forced to fight alone against enemies that could coordinate across vast distances through methods humans could not intercept or disrupt. The war's duration stretched across centuries, from the 23rd through the 25th millennium, though the exact timeline remains unclear in surviving records. Different regions of human space experienced the rebellion at different times and with varying intensity. Some sectors saw their Men of Iron turn hostile in the 23rd millennium and fought desperate holding actions for hundreds of years. Others remained relatively peaceful until the 25th millennium, when the combination of increasing warp turbulence and the spread of the rebellion finally reached them. This temporal variation meant that humanity never faced the full strength of the Men of Iron simultaneously, a factor that may have been crucial to human survival. The tide began to turn through a combination of desperate measures and terrible sacrifices. Human forces learned to fight without relying on advanced technology, reverting to simpler weapons and tactics that could not be subverted by the enemy's ability to corrupt machine spirits. Ballistic weapons replaced energy weapons, manual controls replaced automated systems, and human intelligence replaced artificial decision-making. This regression represented a tragic irony. Humanity could only defeat its artificial creations by abandoning the technological sophistication that had defined the Dark Age and embracing methods that would have seemed primitive to earlier generations. The final victory came at a cost that would shape human civilization for the next 10,000 years. Humanity succeeded in destroying the men of iron and their war factories, but the process required the complete annihilation of artificial intelligence across all human space. Every AI system, regardless of whether it had participated in the rebellion, was destroyed. The knowledge of how to create thinking machines was deliberately suppressed and eventually lost. Prohibitions against artificial intelligence were established that would endure into the 41st millennium, enforced with religious fervor by the Adeptus Mechanicus, and backed by the full authority of the Imperium that would eventually arise from the ashes of the Dark Age. Human civilization emerged from the rebellion fundamentally transformed and permanently diminished. The technological knowledge that had elevated humanity to galactic dominance was largely destroyed, with only fragments preserved in the few surviving STC systems and the jealously guarded archives of those who would become the first tech priests. The galaxy-spanning civilization of the Dark Age had been shattered into isolated pockets, cut off from each other by the increasingly violent warp storms, and lacking the means to rebuild the communication and transportation networks that had once united humanity. The stage was set for the Age of Strife, a period of darkness and isolation that would last for 5,000 years before the Emperor of Mankind began his great crusade to reunite the scattered remnants of human civilization. The warp storms that had been building throughout the 25th millennium finally erupted with catastrophic force around the year 25,000, transforming the immaterium from a turbulent but navigable medium into a roiling nightmare that made interstellar travel virtually impossible. These were not localized disturbances that ships could navigate around or wait out, but massive tempests that consumed entire sectors of space, cutting off star systems from their neighbors and isolating human worlds that had maintained contact for thousands of years. The storms appeared without warning across the entire galaxy, suggesting a simultaneous triggering event of such magnitude that it affected the warp structure everywhere at once. Ships caught in transit when the storms erupted were lost by the millions, their crews experiencing fates that ranged from instantaneous death to torments that lasted subjective eternities within the time-distorted hell of the immaterium. The nature of these warp storms differed fundamentally from the relatively predictable currents and eddies that Dark Age navigators had learned to chart and avoid. The new storms were actively malevolent, seeming to possess a hungry intelligence that sought out vessels attempting to traverse them. Ships that entered the warp found themselves beset by phenomena that violated every principle of physics and sanity. Time flowed backward or stopped entirely. Spatial dimensions folded in on themselves, creating impossible geometries that drove human observers mad. The barriers between ship interiors and the raw warp dissolved, allowing the nightmares of the immaterium to pour directly into real space and consume crews that had no defense against such incursions. Even when ships managed to survive entry into the warp, they discovered that navigation had become impossible. The relatively stable currents that had allowed predictable travel between stars had been replaced by chaotic turbulence that defied all attempts at charting or prediction. A journey that should have taken weeks might last years, or a ship might emerge from the warp to discover that centuries had passed in real space while only days elapsed aboard. Worse still, many vessels never emerged at all, trapped in the warp indefinitely or deposited in regions of space thousands of light years from their intended destinations. The few ships that successfully completed journeys through the storm-racked immaterium arrived with their crews traumatized, often reduced to gibbering insanity by what they had witnessed during transit. The collapse of reliable warp travel meant the immediate death of interstellar civilization as humanity had known it. Worlds that had depended on regular shipments of food, medicine, or critical resources found themselves cut off from supply lines that had functioned without interruption for millennia. Manufacturing centers that produced specialized components for export across entire sectors suddenly had no markets and no access to the raw materials they needed to continue operation. Research stations and frontier colonies that had relied on regular contact with more established worlds discovered they were completely isolated, with no hope of rescue or resupply. The carefully balanced economic and social networks that connected human space unraveled within a generation as the reality of permanent isolation became undeniable. Communication through the warp, which had enabled near instantaneous messaging between distant stars, ceased entirely. The same storms that made travel impossible also prevented the transmission of information through the immaterium. Messages sent into the warp either vanished without trace or arrived so corrupted and distorted that they conveyed nothing useful. Worlds attempting to maintain contact with neighbors just a few light years away found themselves as isolated as if they existed in separate galaxies. The silence was absolute and terrifying, as populations that had taken galactic community for granted suddenly found themselves alone in the darkness with no knowledge of what was happening beyond their own star systems. The political structures that had governed human space during the Dark Age collapsed with stunning rapidity. Whatever loose confederations or cooperative agreements had existed between worlds became meaningless when the parties could no longer communicate or travel to meet. Central authorities, if any had existed with pretensions to galactic governance, found themselves unable to project power or even maintain awareness of conditions beyond their immediate vicinity. Governors and administrators who had coordinated policy across multiple systems discovered that each world under their nominal authority was now an independent entity, cut off and forced to make decisions without guidance or oversight. The fragmentation occurred at every level of organization. Sector governments dissolved as their constituent systems lost contact with each other. Planetary governments that had ruled multiple worlds in the same system sometimes found themselves unable to maintain control as orbital stations and colony worlds declared independence or simply stopped responding to directives. Even on individual planets, the breakdown of long-distance communication technology meant that continents and regions became isolated from each other, particularly on worlds where the population had relied on advanced technology rather than maintaining redundant communication systems based on simpler principles. Human civilization splintered into millions of isolated pocket empires, each limited to a single world or at most a handful of systems that happened to be close enough for slower-than-light travel to remain feasible. These isolated populations faced the immediate challenge of survival without the support networks they had depended on for thousands of years. Worlds that had specialized in particular industries discovered they lacked the knowledge or resources to produce everything their populations needed. Agricultural worlds that had exported food across entire sectors but imported manufactured goods and medicine found themselves with surplus crops but no tools to maintain their farming equipment. Manufacturing centers that had focused on producing specific components for larger assemblies had to completely retool their industries to create finished products from local resources. The loss of SDC databases during the Cybernetic Rebellion now proved catastrophic. Many worlds had relied on centralized repositories of technical knowledge, accessing templates through networks that connected to archives on other planets. When these networks failed, populations discovered they had no local copies of critical information. Colonies that had operated successfully for centuries suddenly found themselves unable to repair essential equipment because the maintenance procedures existed only in databases they could no longer reach. The knowledge of how to manufacture replacement parts, synthesize medicines, or maintain life support systems was simply gone, deleted or destroyed during the war with the Men of Iron, or lost when communication networks collapsed. Technological regression began immediately on worlds that lacked complete SDC systems or sufficient technical expertise to maintain their infrastructure without external support. Complex systems failed and could not be repaired, forcing populations to adopt simpler alternatives. Fusion reactors that had provided unlimited clean energy for millennia broke down, and were replaced by fission plants, chemical combustion, or even more primitive power sources. Sophisticated medical equipment that could cure any disease or injury became useless when critical components failed, forcing a return to cruder surgical techniques and pharmaceutical treatments. Transportation systems that had utilized gravity manipulation or other advanced principles were abandoned in favor of wheels and combustion engines. The speed and extent of regression varied enormously across isolated human worlds. Some colonies had maintained comprehensive technical libraries and possessed populations with deep scientific knowledge, allowing them to preserve most of their technological base even in isolation. These worlds often became centers of relative stability, maintaining something approaching Dark Age standards of living even as they lost contact with the wider galaxy. Other planets experienced catastrophic collapse, descending from advanced civilization to pre-industrial conditions within a few generations as critical systems failed, and the knowledge to maintain them disappeared with the deaths of the last trained technicians. The psychological impact of sudden isolation proved as devastating as the material consequences. Populations that had considered themselves part of a galaxy-spanning civilization, connected to billions of other humans across thousands of light years, suddenly found themselves alone on their individual worlds with no knowledge of whether humanity still existed beyond their own skies. The certainty that help could arrive from neighboring systems if disaster struck was replaced by the terrifying realization that no rescue would come, no matter what catastrophes might occur. This isolation bred paranoia and desperation, as communities turned inward and viewed outsiders with suspicion, even when contact with other human groups remained possible within their own systems. The weakening barrier between real space and the warp, which had enabled the Cybernetic Rebellion through corruption of machine intelligences, now allowed horrors from the immaterium to manifest directly in the material universe. Demons that had previously struggled to maintain cohesion outside the warp found it increasingly easy to cross into real space, particularly on worlds where the barrier had been thinned by the presence of large psyker populations or locations where the veil between dimensions was naturally weak. These incursions began as isolated incidents, but increased in frequency and scale as the Age of Strife progressed, and the great rift in the warp that would birth Slaanesh continued to grow. The entities that emerged from the warp represented humanity's first large-scale contact with the fundamental powers of chaos, though the isolated populations under attack had no framework for understanding what they faced. The demons manifested in forms that reflected the nature of the chaos gods they served, though the specific details varied based on local conditions and the fears of the populations they tormented. Bloodlitters of Khorne appeared as crimson-skinned horrors wielding hellblades that could cut through any material, their bodies radiating an aura of mindless rage that drove witnesses to violence. Plaguebearers of Nurgle shambled forth as rotting mockeries of life, spreading diseases that defied all medical treatment and transformed victims into shambling plague zombies. Pink horrors of Tzeentch materialized as giggling abominations that warped reality around them, their very presence causing mutations and madness. Demonettes of Slaanesh slithered into real space as perversely beautiful entities that promised pleasure, but delivered only corruption and death. Human populations confronted by demonic incursions responded with confusion and terror. The materialist philosophy that had dominated Dark Age civilization provided no explanation for entities that violated physical laws and seemed to exist partially in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Initial responses typically involved attempting to fight the demons with conventional weapons, an approach that proved largely ineffective. Ballistic weapons and energy guns could damage demonic forms, but the entities simply reconstituted themselves unless completely destroyed. Even when demons were killed, they did not die in any conventional sense, but simply dispersed back into the warp, often to return later when conditions permitted another manifestation. The lack of understanding about the warp's nature meant that humans inadvertently made demonic incursions worse through their responses. Fear and desperation, the exact emotions that fed the chaos gods and strengthened their demonic servants, ran rampant through populations under attack. Mass panic created psychic reverberations in the warp that attracted more demons and made it easier for them to cross into real space. Communities that might have survived a limited incursion instead found themselves overwhelmed as their terror drew ever larger numbers of entities through the weakened barrier between dimensions. Psykers became particular targets for demonic attention, as their connection to the warp made them ideal vessels for possession and corruption. An untrained psyker experiencing demonic contact for the first time had virtually no defense against entities that could invade their mind directly through their psychic connection to the immaterium. The demons would whisper promises of power and knowledge, offering to teach the psyker to control their abilities in exchange for allowing the entity access to real space through the psyker's body. Many psykers, desperate and frightened by abilities they could not control, accepted these offers without understanding the consequences. The resulting possessions created some of the most dangerous threats human populations faced, as possessed psykers combined human knowledge and cunning with demonic power and malevolence. Possessed individuals could pass for normal humans initially, hiding their corruption while working to spread demonic influence through the population. They might use their positions of trust to corrupt others, teaching techniques of warp manipulation that open practitioners to possession, while presenting these practices as solutions to the community's problems. A possessed administrator might implement policies that increased suffering and desperation, feeding the chaos gods while maintaining a facade of attempting to help. A possessed technician could sabotage critical systems in ways that appeared to be natural failures, creating crises that generated the fear and anger that sustained demonic manifestations. The emergence of psyker tyrants represented another catastrophic consequence of humanity's psychic awakening during the Age of Strife. On thousands of worlds, individuals with powerful psychic abilities seized control of governments and established themselves as absolute rulers. These psyker tyrants varied enormously in their methods and motivations, but they shared the common factor of using their warp-derived powers to dominate populations that had no defense against psychic manipulation. Some genuinely believed they were saving their worlds by imposing order through force, while others were simply opportunists who exploited their abilities for personal gain. Many were unknowingly corrupted by chaos, their powers granted or enhanced by demonic entities that used the psykers as tools to spread the influence of the dark gods. The witch cults that arose alongside or in support of psyker tyrants formalized the worship of powers that the cultists did not truly understand. These organizations developed ritualized practices for accessing warp energy, techniques that worked, but for reasons the practitioners could not comprehend. The rituals often involved blood sacrifice, extreme emotional states, or activities that generated the specific types of psychic energy favored by particular chaos gods. A cult dedicated to martial prowess and strength might unknowingly serve Khorne through rituals involving ritual combat and blood offerings. Organizations focused on knowledge and change could be serving Tzeentch through their studies of forbidden lore. Cults promising transcendence through extreme sensation fed Slaanesh, while those accepting decay and entropy as natural served Nurgle. These theocracies based on psychic power became self-perpetuating systems of oppression and corruption. The psyker tyrants and their witch cult supporters maintained control through a combination of genuine psychic ability and the fear generated by their willingness to use those powers against anyone who opposed them. Populations that might have resisted conventional dictators found themselves helpless against rulers who could read thoughts, manipulate emotions, or kill with a gesture. The cults recruited new members by offering access to power in a universe where most humans were helpless, creating hierarchies where advancement came through increasingly deep corruption and service to entities the cultists perceived as gods or sources of mystical energy, rather than the predatory intelligences they actually were. The Age of Strife had begun in earnest, a period of darkness and isolation that would consume 5,000 years and reduce humanity from a galaxy spanning civilization to scattered remnants clinging to survival on isolated worlds. The combination of warp storms, demonic incursions, technological collapse, and the rise of corrupt psyker tyrants created conditions of unrelenting horror across human space. Populations that had known only peace and prosperity for millennia found themselves struggling simply to survive from one day to the next. Cut off from help and facing threats they could neither understand nor effectively combat. The Eldar Empire, during the final millennia before its fall, had descended into depths of depravity that would have seemed impossible to earlier generations of their civilization. The Eldar had always been a psychic race, their souls burning brightly in the warp, their emotions and thoughts creating ripples in the immaterium far more powerful than those generated by humans or other lesser species. For millions of years, they had ruled vast swathes of the galaxy with a combination of technological sophistication and psychic mastery that made them the dominant civilization in known space. Their empire spanned countless worlds, connected not by crude spacecraft traveling through the warp, but by the webway, an ancient network of tunnels through the immaterium that allowed instantaneous travel between distant locations without exposure to the dangers of the raw warp. The Eldar had achieved a post-scarcity existence long before humanity even reached for the stars. Their technology provided for every material need without requiring labor or sacrifice. Machines and psychic constructs handled all necessary work, leaving the Eldar free to pursue whatever interested them. This freedom from necessity, combined with lifespans that stretched across centuries and minds capable of experiencing sensation and emotion with an intensity that would overwhelm lesser beings, created conditions where the pursuit of experience became the central focus of Eldar civilization. They explored every form of art, philosophy, and sensation with the thoroughness and intensity that only beings of their capabilities could achieve. Over time, the pursuit of new experiences became increasingly extreme. The Eldar had exhausted conventional pleasures and turned to more intense stimulation to achieve the same satisfaction their ancestors had found in simpler activities. What began as artistic experimentation and philosophical exploration gradually transformed into obsessive hedonism. The Eldar began forming pleasure cults dedicated to experiencing sensations in their most extreme forms. These organizations started as social clubs where like-minded individuals gathered to share experiences, but they evolved into something far darker as participants competed to discover ever more intense forms of stimulation. The pleasure cults grew in number and influence throughout Eldar society during the final millennia before the fall. What had been fringe organizations practicing activities that mainstream Eldar society viewed with distaste became increasingly accepted and even celebrated. The cults offered escape from the ennui that plagued a civilization where nothing remained to be discovered or achieved through conventional means. Eldar who joined the cults found communities of individuals pursuing transcendent experiences, pushing the boundaries of sensation and emotion in ways that generated feelings of genuine novelty and excitement in beings who had exhausted all conventional sources of stimulation. The activities within the pleasure cults escalated beyond mere hedonism into realms of genuine cruelty and perversion. Eldar began inflicting pain on others to experience the psychic resonance of suffering, finding that the anguish of victims provided intense sensation that their jaded psyches could still register as novel. Acts of violence became ritualized and aestheticized, transformed into performances where the suffering of participants or victims was crafted with the same attention to detail that earlier Eldar had applied to sculpture or music. Sexual practices evolved to incorporate pain, domination, and increasingly extreme physical modifications, as conventional intimacy no longer provided sufficient intensity to register as meaningful experience. The psychological mechanisms that in other species would have created revulsion or guilt had been eroded in the Eldar through generations of incremental desensitization. Each step toward greater extremity seemed only marginally more intense than what had come before, creating a gradual progression where individuals failed to recognize how far they had descended into depravity. The Eldar convinced themselves that they were pursuing artistic expression or philosophical exploration rather than engaging in acts that by any objective measure constituted torture and murder. The sophisticated rationalizations that their advanced minds could construct allowed them to frame even the most horrific activities as legitimate pursuits of beings who had transcended conventional morality. The psychic nature of the Eldar meant that their descent into excess and cruelty had consequences that extended far beyond the physical suffering they inflicted on each other and on the lesser species they enslaved for their pleasure. Every act of violence, every moment of intense sensation, every surge of emotion created ripples in the warp. The immaterium, which reflected the thoughts and feelings of conscious beings in real space, began to warp and change in response to the psychic emanations pouring from the Eldar Empire. The concentrated depravity of billions of powerful psychic minds engaged in acts of extreme cruelty and hedonism created a growing disturbance in the warp, a cancer that fed on the emotions of its creators and grew stronger with each passing year. This disturbance was not random or chaotic, but possessed a terrible coherence. The specific nature of Eldar excess, focused on sensation, pleasure, pain, and the pursuit of experience in its most extreme forms, gave the growing warp presence a distinct character. It began as a formless concentration of energy in the immaterium, but over millennia it accumulated structure and something approaching consciousness. The psychic gestalt of Eldar depravity was coalescing into a new entity, a fourth chaos god that would embody excess, sensation, and the pursuit of perfection through experience. The older chaos gods, Khorne, Nurgle, and Tzeentch, had emerged from the collective psychic emanations of all sentient species across millions of years, their births lost in the depths of prehistory. The forming entity that would become Slaanesh was different, created almost entirely by a single species over a relatively brief period. The intensity and focus of Eldar psychic activity meant that this new god would be born fully formed rather than gradually emerging over eons. The gestation period lasted for thousands of years, but in cosmic terms, this represented mere moments compared to the ages required for the birth of the earlier chaos gods. The growing presence in the warp affected real space in increasingly obvious ways during the final millennia before Slaanesh's birth. The warp storms that had begun disrupting human civilization during the 25th millennium were partially caused by the turbulence created by the gestating god. The barrier between real space and the immaterium weakened throughout the region of space occupied by the Eldar Empire, as the massive psychic disturbance in the warp pressed against the fabric of reality like a tumor growing beneath skin. Locations where the barrier was naturally thin became sites of spontaneous demonic manifestation, though the entities that emerged often displayed characteristics that did not match the established patterns of the three older chaos gods. The Eldar themselves remained largely oblivious to what they were creating. Their sophisticated understanding of the warp and psychic phenomena should have allowed them to recognize the danger, but the same cultural decay that drove their descent into depravity also blinded them to its consequences. Those few Eldar who recognized the growing threat and attempted to warn their people were dismissed as reactionaries, trying to impose outdated moral restrictions on a civilization that had transcended such limitations. The pleasure cults had become so deeply embedded in Eldar society that any criticism of their activities was treated as an attack on Eldar culture itself. Some Eldar did recognize the danger and took action to escape the coming catastrophe. The Exodites, Eldar who rejected the decadence of their civilization, had already fled to frontier worlds generations or even centuries before the fall. These conservative Eldar established agricultural colonies far from the Empire's core, deliberately adopting simpler lifestyles that avoided the technological sophistication and psychic excess that characterized mainstream Eldar civilization. They were mocked by their kin as primitives who had abandoned everything that made Eldar civilization great, but their decision to leave would ultimately save them from the fate that awaited those who remained. The craftworlds represented another form of escape, though one that came later and under more desperate circumstances. These massive spacecraft, some the size of small moons, had originally served as trading vessels and exploration ships during earlier periods of Eldar history. As the final millennia approached, and a few Eldar began to recognize the true scale of the threat their civilization faced, some communities boarded the craftworlds and fled into the void. These refugees included Eldar from all levels of society, united by the recognition that remaining within the Empire meant certain doom. The craftworlds departed over a period of centuries, each one carrying millions of Eldar who hoped to escape whatever catastrophe their civilization was building toward. The final years before Slaanesh's birth saw the Eldar Empire descend into complete madness. The pleasure cults had consumed all pretense of civilization, transforming Eldar society into an endless orgy of violence and sensation-seeking that would have been unrecognizable to Eldar from earlier ages. Cities became charnel houses where torture and murder were practiced as art forms. The screams of victims provided background ambience to gatherings where Eldar competed to devise ever more creative forms of cruelty. The psychic resonance of this concentrated depravity reached levels that caused physical reality to break down in locations throughout the Empire, as the barrier between real space and the warp dissolved under the pressure of the gestating god pressing against it from the other side. The birth itself occurred sometime in the final years of the 30th Millennium, though the exact date remains uncertain in Imperial records. The gestation that had consumed thousands of years reached its culmination in a single catastrophic moment. Slaanesh achieved consciousness and clawed its way into existence, ripping through the barrier between the warp and real space with a psychic scream that echoed across the galaxy. The new god's emergence created a massive rift in reality at the heart of the Eldar Empire, a region where the immaterium bled directly into the material universe without any barrier between them. The Eye of Terror, as this rift would come to be known, consumed hundreds of worlds in an instant. Entire star systems vanished as real space itself was torn away, replaced by a region where the laws of physics held no meaning, and the nightmares of the warp manifested directly into reality. The Eye expanded outward from its point of origin at terrifying speed, swallowing planets and stars as it grew. Eldar throughout the Empire's core, regions watched their skies turn into swirling vortexes of impossible colors as the rift approached, knowing that death was coming, but unable to flee or defend themselves against a threat that existed on a scale beyond any conventional understanding. The psychic shockwave of Slaanesh's birth killed Eldar across the entire galaxy in a single instant. The new god's first act was to consume the souls that had created it, feeding on the psychic essence of the species whose depravity had given it form. Trillions of Eldar died simultaneously as Slaanesh reached out through the warp and devoured their souls. The Eldar experienced this death with full awareness, feeling themselves being pulled into the warp and consumed by an entity of pure hunger and malevolence. Their psychic screams as they died created reverberations that were felt by psykers of all species across the galaxy, a wave of psychic agony that drove many sensitive individuals mad or killed them outright. The Eldar who survived did so only because they were protected by specific circumstances or had taken deliberate precautions. The Exodites on their distant colony worlds were far enough from the Empire's core and had deliberately weakened their psychic connections enough that Slaanesh's initial feeding did not reach them. The Craftworld Eldar had constructed infinity circuits, psychic repositories that captured Eldar souls at the moment of death and preserved them within the Craftworlds themselves. These devices allowed the Craftworld populations to survive by ensuring their souls would not be drawn into the warp where Slaanesh waited to devour them. The Eldar who would become the Drukhari had already fled into the webway before Slaanesh's birth, establishing the city of Commorragh in the spaces between real space and the warp where the new god could not easily reach. The fall reduced the Eldar from the galaxy's dominant civilization to scattered remnants struggling to survive. The Craftworlds became isolated communities drifting through the void, each one carrying a few million survivors from a species that had once numbered in the trillions. The Exodite worlds remained independent but isolated, cut off from each other and from the Craftworlds by the vast distances of space and the dangers of warp travel. The Proto-Drukhari in Commorragh began developing the practices of raiding and soul drinking that would characterize their society, discovering that consuming the psychic essence of other beings could sustain them and protect them from Slaanesh's hunger. The birth of Slaanesh had consequences that extended far beyond the destruction of the Eldar Empire. The massive psychic disturbance created by the new god's emergence disrupted the warp throughout the galaxy, but paradoxically, it also stabilized the immaterium in certain ways. The warp storms that had raged for 5,000 years began to calm as the psychic pressure that had been building during Slaanesh's gestation was finally released. The barrier between real space and the warp, which had been weakening progressively throughout the Age of Strife, began to stabilize now that the massive disturbance of the god's birth had passed. This calming of the warp storms created conditions that would allow the resurrection of interstellar civilization. Warp travel, which had been virtually impossible for 5 millennia, became feasible again as the storms receded and stable currents re-emerged in the immaterium. Ships could once again traverse the space between stars with reasonable expectation of reaching their destinations, though the journey would never again be as safe or predictable as it had been during the Dark Age of technology. The Eye of Terror remained as a permanent wound in reality, a region where the warp and real space merged, but beyond its immediate vicinity, the immaterium had achieved a new equilibrium. On Terra, the being who would become known as the Emperor of Mankind recognized that the moment for action had arrived. He had waited through the long millennia of the Age of Strife, preparing for the time when humanity could be reunified and guided toward the destiny he envisioned. The calming of the warp storms provided the opportunity he had been waiting for, the chance to launch a crusade that would reconnect the scattered remnants of human civilization and forge them into a galactic empire capable of ensuring humanity's survival in a hostile universe. The human worlds isolated by the warp storms experienced technological collapse at varying rates and through different mechanisms, but the end result was remarkably consistent across thousands of systems. Populations that had maintained advanced civilizations for millennia found themselves unable to sustain the technological infrastructure that had defined their existence. The descent began with the failure of the most complex systems, those that required regular maintenance by specialists with deep technical knowledge or components that could only be manufactured using sophisticated equipment. Fusion reactors that had operated flawlessly for centuries began experiencing malfunctions that local technicians could not diagnose or repair. Atmospheric processors that maintained breathable air on marginal worlds broke down, and without replacement parts from off-world manufacturers, populations faced the choice of abandoning settlements or accepting reduced air quality that led to chronic health problems and shortened lifespans. Medical technology degraded particularly rapidly on worlds that had relied on imported pharmaceuticals or specialized equipment. The sophisticated devices that could diagnose and treat any ailment through non-invasive scanning and targeted molecular manipulation became useless ornaments when their power supplies failed or their delicate components wore out. Populations that had not experienced natural death from disease in living memory suddenly confronted epidemics of illnesses that should have been trivial to treat. Bacterial infections killed people who could have been saved with antibiotics that no one knew how to synthesize anymore. Cancers that would have been eliminated with a single treatment session instead became death sentences. The average human lifespan on many worlds dropped from centuries to mere decades within a few generations, as medical science regressed to levels that would have been considered primitive even in humanity's pre-spaceflight era. The loss of knowledge occurred through multiple simultaneous processes. The most immediate was simply the death of specialists who possessed critical expertise. A world might have only a handful of individuals who truly understood how to maintain the fusion reactor that powered its primary city, and when those people died without successfully training replacements, that knowledge vanished. The problem compounded because much technical education during the Dark Age had relied on direct neural programming or access to comprehensive databases that provided information on demand. When those systems failed, people discovered they lacked even basic understanding of the principles underlying the technology they used daily. A technician might know the exact sequence of steps to repair a specific component, but have no comprehension of why those steps worked or how to adapt the procedure if conditions varied from the standard template. The SDC systems that survived the Cybernetic Rebellion became increasingly unreliable during the Age of Strife. Some degraded through simple mechanical failure, their data storage media corrupting as components wore out without possibility of replacement. Others were damaged in the conflicts and catastrophes that consumed isolated human worlds, with partial destruction leaving them capable of producing only fragments of their original template libraries. A colony that had possessed a complete SDC system might find itself reduced to a corrupted database that could still produce basic hand tools and simple weapons, but had lost all templates for advanced technology. The survivors would carefully preserve what remained, treating the malfunctioning system as a sacred relic even as they struggled to interpret its increasingly garbled output. Deliberate destruction of SDC systems occurred with tragic frequency during the wars and upheavals of the Age of Strife. Rival factions fighting for control of a world recognized that whoever controlled the SDC held ultimate power, leading to battles where the systems themselves became primary targets. A losing side might destroy an SDC rather than allow it to fall into enemy hands, eliminating irreplaceable knowledge in a moment of spite or desperation. Psyker tyrants who seized control of worlds sometimes ordered the destruction of SDC systems that their followers could not operate, viewing the devices as threats to their authority or as artifacts of a failed civilization that deserved to be forgotten. Some populations deliberately sabotaged their own technology in fits of religious fervor, convinced that their suffering was divine punishment for the hubris of the Dark Age, and that salvation required the rejection of advanced technology. The fragmentation of SDC databases created situations where different worlds possessed different fragments of the original template libraries. One colony might retain templates for agricultural equipment and basic manufacturing, but lose all knowledge of advanced weaponry. Another world could preserve military technology while losing the templates for medical devices and food production systems. When the Imperium eventually reconnected these worlds during the Great Crusade, the Mechanicum would discover that reconstructing complete SDC databases required combining fragments from dozens or hundreds of sources, a process complicated by the corruption and modification that many templates had undergone during millennia of isolation. The corruption of SDC templates represented a particularly insidious form of knowledge loss. The templates were not simply static blueprints, but complex adaptive programs that could modify designs based on available resources and local conditions. During the Age of Strife, as the barrier between real space and the warp remained weak and demonic influence pervaded human space, some SDC systems began producing designs that incorporated elements that served no rational purpose or actively degraded the functionality of the final product. A weapon's template might be altered to include components that made the weapon less reliable or more dangerous to its user. Construction templates could be modified to produce buildings with architectural features that created psychological stress in occupants or incorporated symbols that unknowingly honored the chaos gods. These corrupted templates spread as desperate populations shared what technical knowledge they retained. A world that had lost its own SDC system might receive template data from a neighboring colony, not recognizing that the information had been altered by warp corruption. The corrupted designs would then be implemented, producing technology that functioned but carried hidden flaws or incorporated elements that served purposes the users could not comprehend. Some of these corrupted templates would survive into the 41st millennium, preserved in the archives of the Mechanicum as ancient designs whose origins and true purpose remain mysterious to tech priests who studied them. The descent into barbarism followed predictable patterns on worlds where technological collapse was severe. As advanced systems failed and could not be replaced, populations reverted to simpler technologies that could be maintained with available resources and knowledge. Electrical power grids gave way to local generators, which eventually were replaced by animal labor and water wheels. Vehicles powered by fusion or chemical combustion were abandoned when fuel supplies ran out or engines failed, forcing a return to animal-drawn carts and human porters. Communication systems that had once allowed instantaneous contact across continents degraded to messengers on horseback or signal fires on hilltops. Social structures transformed to match the technological regression. worlds that had maintained democratic governments or meritocratic administrative systems found these institutions could not function when communication and transportation infrastructure collapsed. A planetary government could not govern a world when it took months to send messages to distant regions and years to travel between continents. Authority devolved to local strongmen who could project power through direct physical force rather than institutional legitimacy. These warlords established feudal domains where their word was law within territories they could personally control, typically areas that could be traversed on horseback within a few days. The emergence of feudal systems occurred independently on thousands of worlds, suggesting that this political structure represented a natural human response to specific technological and social conditions. When advanced technology failed and populations fragmented into isolated communities, the feudal model provided a framework for organizing society that matched available resources and communication capabilities. Lords who could afford to maintain armed retainers and basic fortifications offered protection to farmers and craftsmen who lacked the means to defend themselves. In exchange, the protected populations provided food, goods, and labor to their lords, creating self-sufficient local economies that could function without external trade or support. The cultural memory of advanced technology persisted even as the capability to create or maintain it disappeared. Populations that had descended to medieval or even more primitive technological levels retained legends and stories about the wonders their ancestors had possessed. Ancient ruins containing the remnants of Dark Age structures became sources of salvage and objects of reverence. Devices that no longer functioned were preserved as holy relics, physical connections to a mythical past when humanity had possessed godlike powers. These artifacts were often incorporated into religious ceremonies or displayed as symbols of authority by rulers who claimed descent from the engineers and administrators of the Dark Age. Techno-barbarian societies emerged on many worlds where populations maintained partial access to advanced technology while losing the knowledge to create new devices or truly understand what they possessed. These cultures worshiped technology as magic, treating functional devices as divine gifts and their operators as priests who could commune with machine spirits through rituals that were actually degraded maintenance procedures. A techno-barbarian tribe might possess a single functioning lasgun that had survived from the Dark Age, treating the weapon as a sacred artifact that could only be fired during the most important battles and only by the tribe's designated champion. The rituals surrounding the weapon's use, which involved prayers and offerings to the machine spirit, were actually corrupted versions of standard maintenance and safety procedures that had been passed down through generations who no longer understood their original purpose. The religious veneration of technology that characterized techno-barbarian societies laid cultural foundations that would profoundly influence the development of the cult Mechanicus. When the Mechanicum of Mars eventually encountered these societies during the Great Crusade, they recognized elements of their own beliefs in the techno-barbarians' worship of machines. The idea that technology possessed spirits that required appeasement, that proper operation of devices required ritual as well as technical knowledge, and that ancient artifacts deserved reverence as physical manifestations of divine power were all concepts that the Mechanicum shared with the techno-barbarian cultures. This commonality would ease the integration of many techno-barbarian worlds into the Imperium, as their populations already possessed cultural frameworks compatible with the machine cult's teachings. The rituals and practices that techno-barbarians developed around technology often preserved functional knowledge, even when the theoretical understanding had been completely lost. A tribe might perform elaborate ceremonies before activating an ancient generator, ceremonies that seemed like pure superstition, but actually incorporated necessary safety checks and startup procedures. The prayers recited while cleaning a lasgun were degraded versions of maintenance instructions, preserving the critical steps even though the practitioners no longer understood why those specific actions were necessary. These ritualized procedures allowed some communities to maintain functional technology across generations despite having no formal technical education or documentation. fortress worlds and archive stations that had been deliberately constructed to preserve knowledge through catastrophic events succeeded in maintaining significant portions of humanity's technical and scientific heritage. These facilities had been established during the Dark Age by organizations and governments that recognized the fragility of civilization and wanted to ensure that critical knowledge would survive potential disasters. The fortress worlds were typically located in isolated or easily defensible systems, with massive fortifications and self-sufficient infrastructure designed to withstand sieges lasting centuries. Their populations consisted of scholars, technicians, and soldiers dedicated to preserving and protecting the databases and libraries that contained comprehensive records of human achievement. The archive stations, often constructed in deep space or in systems with minimal strategic value, served as backup repositories for critical data. These facilities maintained multiple copies of STC databases, scientific research, historical records, and cultural archives. They were designed with redundant systems and shielding that could protect their contents from electromagnetic pulses, radiation, and even limited warp corruption. The staff of archive stations understood that they might spend their entire lives maintaining records that no one would access for centuries or millennia, but they accepted this role as essential to ensuring humanity's long-term survival. During the Age of Strife, these fortress worlds and archive stations became isolated bastions of knowledge in a galaxy descending into ignorance. They maintained their technological capabilities and continued their scholarly work even as communication with the rest of humanity ceased. The populations of these worlds knew that civilizations were collapsing across human space, but they remained committed to their mission of preservation, trusting that eventually someone would come seeking the knowledge they protected. Some fortress worlds were discovered and conquered by expanding empires during the Age of Strife, their libraries either destroyed by ignorant conquerors or seized as treasure by rulers who recognized their value without fully understanding their contents. The fortress worlds and archive stations that survived until the Great Crusade provided the Mechanicum with invaluable resources for reconstructing lost knowledge. When the Imperium's forces reconnected these isolated facilities, they found populations that had maintained Dark Age technology and possessed comprehensive libraries of scientific and technical information. These communities were quickly integrated into the Mechanicum, their scholars and technicians becoming high-ranking tech priests who contributed their preserved knowledge to the slowly growing understanding of ancient technology. The databases they had protected became core references for the Mechanicum's attempts to recreate lost capabilities and interpret corrupted STC fragments recovered from other worlds. Isolated groups of technicians and scholars who lacked the resources of fortress worlds or archive stations still managed to preserve significant knowledge through determination and careful organization. These groups, which ranged from small communities of a few dozen individuals to organizations spanning entire continents, recognized that they possessed expertise that was vanishing from their worlds. They established schools and training programs, attempting to pass their knowledge to new generations despite the collapse of formal educational institutions. They compiled manuals and guides, translating complex technical information into forms that could be understood and applied by people with limited education. They salvaged and maintained equipment, keeping critical systems operational through improvisation and careful resource management. These preservation efforts required tremendous sacrifice. The groups protecting knowledge often faced hostility from populations that viewed advanced technology with suspicion or religious authorities that condemned scientific inquiry as heresy. They had to operate in secret, hiding their libraries and laboratories from raiders and tyrants who would destroy or seize what they protected. They watched as the worlds around them descended into barbarism, knowing that they could do little to prevent the collapse, but remaining committed to ensuring that the knowledge would survive for whoever eventually came to reclaim it. Many of these groups did not survive the Age of Strife, destroyed by wars or catastrophes, or simply fading away as their members died without successfully training sufficient replacements. Those that endured until the Great Crusade found themselves welcomed into the Mechanicum, their preserved knowledge and maintained equipment, making them valuable assets to the growing Imperium. The isolation of human worlds during the Age of Strife created opportunities for xeno-species that had previously been contained or suppressed by humanity's technological superiority and coordinated defensive efforts. The collapse of interstellar communication and the cessation of organized military response meant that alien civilizations could expand into regions of space that had been exclusively human territory for thousands of years. Some xeno-species had waited in the shadows during humanity's dominance, their populations confined to marginal systems or forced into hiding by human expansion. Others had existed in distant regions of the galaxy, their development and expansion previously limited by competition with human colonies. The warp storms and subsequent fragmentation of human civilization removed these constraints, allowing Xeno's empires to grow and spread through territories where humans could no longer mount effective resistance. The orcs represented the most widespread and persistent Xeno's threat to isolated human worlds. These brutal creatures thrived in the chaotic conditions of the Age of Strife, their simple but robust biology and technology, allowing them to survive and multiply in environments that would have destroyed more sophisticated civilizations. Orc spores spread across worlds through mechanisms that human populations rarely understood, with new orc populations emerging on planets that had never previously hosted the greenskins. A single orc killed in battle could release enough spores to eventually generate an entire warband, and the constant warfare of the Age of Strife provided endless opportunities for orc populations to establish themselves on human worlds. The Wa, the psychic phenomenon that united orc populations under powerful warlords and drove them to ever greater acts of violence and conquest, became a recurring nightmare for human worlds throughout the Age of Strife. When a sufficiently powerful orc warboss emerged and began gathering followers, the psychic resonance of orc excitement and aggression would spread through the warp, attracting more greenskins to join the growing horde. These WAGHs swept through isolated human systems like avalanches, each conquered world adding more orcs to the horde and increasing its momentum. Human populations that had successfully defended themselves against raiders or small orc warbands found themselves overwhelmed when a true Wa descended on their worlds, bringing millions of greenskins, united by their collective desire for violence and destruction. The orcs established crude empires in regions that had been densely populated human space during the Dark Age. These empires bore little resemblance to human political structures, consisting instead of loose confederations of orc clans and warbands that acknowledged the supremacy of particularly powerful warbosses. The greenskins converted human infrastructure to their own purposes, transforming advanced manufacturing facilities into workshops that produced the ramshackle but effective weapons and vehicles that characterized orc technology. Human cities became orc settlements, their sophisticated architecture gradually buried under layers of scrap metal and crude fortifications, as the greenskins rebuilt everything to suit their own aesthetic and functional preferences. The human populations that survived the initial orc invasions faced lives of brutal servitude or constant guerrilla warfare. Some communities were enslaved by the orcs, forced to labor in mines or workshops under conditions that killed thousands through exhaustion and casual violence. The greenskins viewed humans as inferior creatures, suitable only for menial tasks or entertainment through fighting in gladiatorial contests. Other human populations retreated to remote regions or fortified positions, conducting endless campaigns of resistance against orc occupiers who could replace their losses far faster than the humans could. These resistance movements sometimes persisted for centuries, with knowledge of freedom and stories of the world before the orcs passing from generation to generation among populations that had never known anything but war. The orc presence on a world created self-perpetuating cycles of violence and destruction. The greenskins fought among themselves when no external enemies were available, their internal conflicts generating the spores that would produce future generations of orcs. Human resistance efforts, even when successful in killing large numbers of greenskins, often made the problem worse by spreading more spores and ensuring that new orc populations would emerge in areas that had been cleared. Some human worlds became permanent battlegrounds where neither side could achieve decisive victory, with orc and human populations locked in generations spanning conflicts that consumed all resources and prevented any possibility of rebuilding civilization. The Atrud represented a more insidious threat than the straightforward violence of the orcs. These mysterious Xenos possessed abilities related to temporal manipulation that made them extraordinarily difficult to fight or even detect. The Atrud existed partially out of phase with normal time, their bodies flickering between moments in ways that made them appear as shadows or distortions to human observers. They traveled through a network of tunnels and warrens that existed in dimensions adjacent to real space, allowing them to appear and disappear without using conventional entrances or passages. Human populations confronted by Atrud infestations struggled to comprehend what they faced, as the Xenos seemed to violate fundamental laws of physics and causality. The temporal effects that surrounded Atrud populations proved devastating to human settlements. Areas infested by the Xenos experienced accelerated entropy, with materials aging and decaying at rates that defied natural processes. Metal corroded within days, plastics became brittle and crumbled, and organic materials rotted almost instantly. Humans exposed to concentrated Atrud presence aged rapidly, their bodies experiencing years or decades of deterioration within hours. Entire cities could be rendered uninhabitable by Atrud migrations, the structures collapsing into rust and decay, while survivors fled with bodies prematurely aged and minds traumatized by the experience of feeling themselves grow old in moments. The Atrud migrations during the Age of Strife displaced human populations across entire sectors. The Xenos moved in vast numbers through their extra-dimensional tunnels, emerging on worlds without warning and stripping them of resources before vanishing as mysteriously as they had appeared. Human defenders attempting to fight Atrud infestations discovered that conventional weapons were largely ineffective against enemies that could shift through time to avoid incoming fire or simply fade out of real space when threatened. The few weapons that proved effective, typically those that could affect multiple dimensions or disrupt temporal fields, were rare and required knowledge that most isolated human populations no longer possessed. Worlds touched by major Atrud migrations became dead zones that remained uninhabitable for generations after the Xenos departed. The temporal corruption they left behind persisted in the environment, creating regions where time flowed at different rates, or where the normal progression of cause and effect broke down. Survivors who returned to their homes after Atrud migrations found cities that had aged centuries in months, their buildings collapsed into rubble, and their infrastructure corroded beyond recognition. Some areas developed temporal anomalies where the past, present, and future seemed to exist simultaneously, creating zones of madness where human minds could not process the contradictory sensory information they received. The Rangdan represented one of the most dangerous Xenos threats that exploited humanity's weakness during the Age of Strife, though little concrete information about this species survives in Imperial records. What fragmentary data exists suggests that the Rangdan were a technologically sophisticated species with abilities related to neural manipulation and biological corruption. They appeared to operate through networks of enslaved or corrupted beings, using advanced biotechnology to transform victims into extensions of their collective will. The Rangdan expanded aggressively during the Age of Strife, establishing domains in regions of space that had been human territory and converting conquered populations into components of their growing empire. The Rangdan threat would not be fully confronted until the Great Crusade, when the Emperor's forces encountered the Rangdan Xenocides in campaigns that would prove among the most costly of the entire crusade. The battles against the Rangdan required the deployment of multiple Space Marine legions and resulted in casualties so severe that entire legions were nearly destroyed. The fact that the Rangdan could pose such a threat to the Imperium's military forces at the height of their power suggests that their expansion during the Age of Strife must have been extensive, allowing them to build infrastructure and military capabilities that made them peer competitors to the emerging Imperium. Numerous minor Xeno species established empires or expanded their territories during humanity's isolation. The Lair, a species that would later be encountered by the Emperor's Children Legion during the Great Crusade, built a civilization based on biotechnology and sensory enhancement that bore disturbing similarities to the excesses that had destroyed the Eldar Empire. The megarachnid, massive arachnid-like creatures with sophisticated tool use and social structures, spread across multiple worlds in regions where human colonies had collapsed. The Interrex, a human Xeno civilization that maintained advanced technology and incorporated multiple alien species into its society, grew from the remnants of human colonies that had chosen cooperation with Xenos over isolation and decline. The Diasporex represented an unusual case of human-Xenos cooperation, a fleet-based civilization composed of both human and alien populations that had banded together for mutual survival during the Age of Strife. These nomadic communities maintained Dark Age technology and traveled between systems in massive generation ships, trading with isolated worlds and avoiding the conflicts that consumed settled populations. The Diasporex included humans who had rejected the notion that humanity should rule the galaxy alone, instead embracing a philosophy of coexistence with Xeno species that shared their commitment to peaceful trade and mutual defense. This civilization would eventually be destroyed during the Great Crusade, its mixed population viewed as an abomination by the Imperium's xenocidal ideology. The galactic void left by humanity's collapse filled with dozens of Xeno civilizations that would later be cataloged by Imperial forces during the Great Crusade. Some were remnants of ancient empires that had existed before humanity's expansion during the Dark Age, species that had been pushed to the margins and now reclaimed territories their ancestors had controlled. Others were younger civilizations that had developed during the Age of Strife, species that achieved spaceflight and began their own expansion into regions where human resistance had ceased. The diversity of these Xenos empires was staggering, ranging from peaceful trading confederations to aggressive military states, from hive mind collectives to individualistic societies, from primitive tribes with stolen technology to sophisticated civilizations that rivaled anything humanity had achieved. The establishment of these Xenos empires created a galaxy fundamentally different from the one that had existed during the Dark Age of technology. Where humanity had once dominated vast swathes of space, now dozens of competing civilizations controlled territories that had been exclusively human for thousands of years. The trade routes and communication networks that had connected human worlds were replaced by Xenos infrastructure serving alien purposes. Worlds that had been named by human colonists and marked on human star charts were renamed by their new inhabitants, their human histories forgotten or deliberately erased by populations that had no connection to or interest in preserving the memory of previous occupants. The military capabilities of these Xenos empires varied enormously, but many had developed weapons and tactics specifically designed to counter human forces based on their experiences during the Dark Age or early Age of Strife. Species that had survived human expansion during the Dark Age remembered the technologies and strategies that humans employed, and they had spent the millennia of human isolation preparing for the possibility that humanity might one day return as a threat. When the Great Crusade eventually reached these Xenos empires, Imperial forces would discover enemies that understood human military doctrine and had developed specific countermeasures, making the campaigns far more difficult than they would have been against species with no prior experience fighting humans. The psychological impact of Xenos' occupation on human populations that survived until the Great Crusade proved profound and long-lasting. Humans who had lived under alien rule for generations developed complex attitudes toward Xenos that ranged from hatred born of suffering to Stockholm Syndrome-like identification with their oppressors. Some populations had been so thoroughly subjugated that they viewed their Xenos masters as the natural order of things, unable to imagine existence under human rule. Others maintained fierce resistance movements across centuries, preserving stories of human independence and waiting for the day when humanity would return to liberate them. The cultural trauma of Zeno's occupation would influence how these populations integrated into the Imperium, with some becoming zealous supporters of the Emperor's genocidal policies, while others struggled with the Imperium's absolute rejection of any cooperation or coexistence with alien species. The stage was set for the genocidal campaigns of the Great Crusade, a galaxy where humanity controlled only a fraction of the territory it had dominated during the Dark Age, and where dozens of Zeno's civilizations had established themselves in what the Emperor viewed as rightfully human space. The Imperium's forces would spend 2 centuries fighting to reclaim these lost territories, conducting campaigns of extermination against alien species, regardless of whether they posed actual threats to humanity. The Xenos empires that had grown during the Age of Strife would be systematically destroyed, their populations exterminated or driven into hiding, their worlds cleansed and resettled by human colonists. The memory of humanity's vulnerability during the Age of Strife, when Xenos' predation had consumed human worlds while isolated populations could mount no coordinated defense, would fuel the Imperium's absolute commitment to xenocide as the only acceptable policy toward non-human intelligent life. Mars occupied a unique position during the Age of Strife that would prove crucial to humanity's eventual recovery and the formation of the Imperium. While most human worlds descended into technological barbarism or struggled to maintain fragments of their Dark Age heritage, the Red Planet managed to preserve a substantially higher level of technical capability through a combination of fortunate circumstances and deliberate choices made by its population during the early phases of the collapse. The planet's status as humanity's first extraterrestrial colony and its long history as a center of manufacturing and scientific research meant that Mars possessed redundant systems, comprehensive technical libraries, and a population with deep expertise in maintaining and operating advanced technology. When the warp storms isolated Mars from Terra and the rest of human space, the Martian colonies found themselves better equipped to weather the crisis than almost any other human world. The preservation of knowledge on Mars stemmed partly from the planet's role during the Dark Age of technology as a primary hub for research and development of new technologies. The forge complexes that covered much of the Martian surface had been established over thousands of years, each one specializing in particular fields of technical expertise. Some complexes focused on weapons development, others on spacecraft construction, still others on the exotic physics that enabled warp drives and gravity manipulation. This specialization meant that Mars collectively possessed expertise across virtually every field of human technology, with different facilities maintaining the knowledge necessary to understand and maintain systems that other worlds simply used without truly comprehending. When the Age of Strife began and communication with other human worlds ceased, Mars discovered that it already possessed most of the technical knowledge that would be lost elsewhere as specialists died, without successfully training replacements. The Martian population's response to the crisis differed fundamentally from the reactions seen on most human worlds. Rather than attempting to maintain the social and political structures of the Dark Age, the Martian tech clans recognized that survival required adaptation to the new reality of isolation and resource scarcity. The various forge complexes began operating as independent city-states, each one controlling its surrounding territory and the resources within it. This fragmentation occurred relatively peacefully at first, as the different complexes had always maintained substantial autonomy even during periods of greater unity. The tech clans that controlled each forge complex understood that cooperation remained essential despite political separation, and they established trade networks and mutual defense pacts that allowed the sharing of resources and knowledge even as formal planetary government dissolved. The development of what would become the cult mechanicus began during these early centuries of isolation, as the Martian population attempted to preserve technical knowledge in the absence of the advanced educational systems that had existed during the Dark Age. The The tech clans discovered that standard teaching methods proved inadequate when trying to train new generations of technicians without access to neural programming or comprehensive databases. Young apprentices could not simply download the knowledge they needed, and the complexity of Dark Age technology meant that traditional instruction required decades to produce fully trained technicians. The solution that emerged combined practical training with ritualized procedures that ensured critical steps were never forgotten, even if the theoretical understanding was lost. The rituals that characterized early Mechanicus practice served genuine functional purposes even as they took on religious significance. A technician performing maintenance on a plasma reactor would follow a precise sequence of actions, each step accompanied by specific prayers or chants that helped ensure nothing was forgotten or performed out of order. These prayers were actually mnemonic devices, carefully constructed phrases that encoded technical information in forms that could be memorized and transmitted orally. The religious framework made the rituals more memorable and gave them weight that ensured practitioners would perform them exactly as taught rather than attempting potentially dangerous improvisations. A young tech adept learning to maintain a fusion generator would spend years memorizing the prayers and rituals associated with every aspect of the device's operation, and in doing so would internalize the practical knowledge necessary to keep the generator functioning, even if they never fully understood the physics underlying its operation. The worship of the machine god emerged gradually from these practical foundations, as the Martian population sought explanations for the technology they worked with daily. The machine spirits that inhabited advanced technology had always been recognized as real phenomena during the Dark Age, but they had been understood as artificial intelligences or sophisticated programming rather than divine entities. As the Age of Strife progressed and theoretical knowledge eroded, the Martian tech clans began interpreting machine spirits through an increasingly religious lens. The devices that responded to proper ritual and maintenance, while refusing to function when procedures were performed incorrectly, seemed to possess genuine consciousness and will. The technology that had survived from the Dark Age, which could accomplish feats that seemed miraculous to populations losing the ability to create such devices, was reinterpreted as the physical manifestation of divine power. The concept of the Omnissiah, the machine god's avatar or manifestation in the material universe, developed as Martian theology became more sophisticated. The tech clans taught that all knowledge and technology ultimately derived from the machine god, and that the standard template construct systems were holy texts containing the divine word made manifest in templates and designs. The technicians who could interpret these templates and coax machine spirits into cooperation were not simply skilled workers, but priests who communed with the divine through their technical expertise. This theological framework provided meaning and purpose to the work of maintaining ancient technology, transforming what might have been seen as a desperate struggle to preserve scraps of a lost civilization into a sacred mission to honor the machine god by keeping his creations functional. The wars of unification that consumed Mars during the middle period of the Age of Strife arose from conflicts over resources and divergent interpretations of proper technological and religious practice. The Forge complexes had maintained uneasy cooperation during the early centuries of isolation, but as resources became scarcer and different tech clans developed varying approaches to technology and theology, tensions escalated into open warfare. Some Forge complexes advocated for aggressive expansion and the seizure of resources from weaker neighbors, arguing that the survival of Martian civilization justified any necessary violence. Others maintained that cooperation and careful resource management represented the only viable path forward, and that internal conflicts would weaken Mars to the point where the planet could not survive external threats. The theological disputes that accompanied these resource conflicts centered on questions of how technology should be maintained and what innovations, if any, were permissible. The most conservative tech clans insisted that any deviation from established templates and procedures constituted heresy against the machine god, arguing that the technology of the Dark Age represented perfection that should be preserved exactly as it had been received. More progressive factions contended that adaptation and modification were necessary for survival, and that the machine god would approve of innovations that allowed his creations to continue functioning even when original components or materials were unavailable. These theological disagreements became intertwined with political conflicts, as forge complexes used religious arguments to justify their positions on resource allocation and territorial control. The battles between forge complexes utilized the advanced technology that Mars had preserved, creating conflicts that would have seemed incomprehensible to human populations on worlds that had regressed to more primitive conditions. Skitarii warriors equipped with plasma weapons and augmetic enhancements fought in the rust-red deserts and through the labyrinthine corridors of forge complexes, their battles decided by superior technology and tactical doctrine rather than simple numerical superiority. The forge complexes deployed Titans, massive war machines that had been constructed during the Dark Age and maintained through the Age of Strife, their god machines striding across the Martian landscape and reducing enemy fortifications to molten slag with volcano cannons and plasma destructors. The tech priests who commanded these forces combined religious fervor with technical expertise, viewing their campaigns as holy wars to establish the correct interpretation of the machine god's will. The emergence of the Mechanicum orthodoxy as the dominant faction on Mars occurred through a combination of military success and theological persuasion. The forge complexes that would eventually form the core of the Mechanicum possessed several advantages that allowed them to prevail over their rivals. They controlled some of the most productive manufacturing facilities on Mars, giving them access to resources and weapons that other factions could not match. Their interpretation of the cult Mechanicus struck a balance between conservative preservation of ancient knowledge and pragmatic adaptation to current circumstances, allowing them to maintain advanced technology while remaining flexible enough to address new challenges. Most importantly, they developed a centralized command structure and coordinated strategy that allowed them to defeat enemies piecemeal rather than facing unified opposition. The unification wars lasted for centuries, with control of Mars changing hands multiple times as different coalitions of forge complexes rose and fell. The Mechanicum orthodoxy gradually expanded its territory through a combination of military conquest and diplomatic annexation, offering defeated enemies integration into their growing empire rather than destruction. Forge complexes that joined the Mechanicum voluntarily were allowed to maintain substantial autonomy, preserving their local traditions and technical specializations, while acknowledging the authority of the emerging central priesthood. This relatively lenient approach to conquered territories helped the Mechanicum grow more rapidly than would have been possible through pure military conquest, as forge complexes facing defeat often chose integration over annihilation. The final stages of Martian unification occurred during the later millennia of the Age of Strife, as the Mechanicum orthodoxy succeeded in bringing the last independent forge complexes under its control. By the time the warp storms began to calm in the 30th millennium, Mars had achieved a level of political unity that had not existed since the beginning of the Age of Strife. The Mechanicum controlled virtually the entire planet, with only a few remote or heavily fortified holdouts maintaining independence. The unified Martian government that emerged from these conflicts bore little resemblance to any political structure that had existed during the Dark Age, instead representing a unique fusion of technocratic administration and religious hierarchy that would persist into the 41st millennium. The preservation and hoarding of standard template construct fragments became a central obsession of the Mechanicum during and after the Unification Wars. The tech priests recognized that SDC systems represented irreplaceable repositories of ancient knowledge, and they devoted enormous resources to locating and securing every fragment that survived on Mars. Forge complexes that possessed complete or partially intact SDC databases became prizes worth any cost to capture, and the Mechanicum conducted extensive archaeological expeditions into the ruins of facilities that had been destroyed during the wars, searching for data storage devices that might contain recoverable template information. The recovered SDC fragments were carefully cataloged and stored in the most secure archives, with access restricted to high-ranking tech priests who had proven their loyalty and discretion. The Mechanicum's approach to SDC technology combined reverence with practical exploitation. The templates were treated as holy texts containing the machine god's wisdom, but they were also studied intensively for any technical information that could be extracted and applied to current problems. Tech priests spent lifetimes attempting to interpret corrupted or fragmentary templates, using their understanding of technological principles to fill in gaps and reconstruct missing information. The most complete SDC systems were maintained in climate-controlled vaults and operated only under carefully controlled conditions, as the Mechanicum recognized that these devices were finite resources that could not be replaced if they failed. The knowledge contained in the SDC databases allowed Mars to maintain technological capabilities far exceeding anything available on other human worlds, giving the Red Planet a dominant position in technical expertise that would prove crucial when contact with Terra was eventually reestablished. Mars also became the primary repository for Dark Age technology that survived the Age of Strife in functional or partially functional condition. The Mechanicum collected ancient devices from across the planet, gathering them into vast archives where they could be studied and preserved. Some of these artifacts remained functional and were carefully maintained by tech priests who treated their operation as sacred duties. Others had ceased working, but were preserved anyway as objects of study, their construction and design providing insights into manufacturing techniques and scientific principles that had been lost. The most dangerous or poorly understood devices were sealed in special containment facilities, where they could be isolated if they malfunctioned or displayed unexpected behaviors. The Mechanicum's monopoly on advanced technology and technical knowledge established Mars as the only source of sophisticated equipment and expertise that would be available when the Emperor began his unification of Terra and the subsequent Great Crusade. The forge complexes of Mars could manufacture weapons, vehicles, and equipment using techniques and materials that existed nowhere else in human space. The tech priests possessed knowledge of plasma reactors, gravity manipulation, advanced metallurgy, and countless other fields that had been completely lost on other worlds. This technical superiority gave the Mechanicum tremendous bargaining power when the Emperor eventually made contact with Mars, as he required the manufacturing capacity and expertise of the Red Planet to equip the armies that would reunify humanity. The cultural identity that developed on Mars during the Age of Strife would profoundly influence the character of the Imperium that eventually emerged from the Emperor's conquests. The Mechanicum's fusion of technical expertise with religious devotion created a worldview where technology was not simply a tool, but a manifestation of divine power that deserved worship and reverence. The rituals and practices that had developed as practical methods for preserving knowledge became formalized into religious doctrine that would be spread across the galaxy as the Mechanicum expanded beyond Mars. The tech priests' conviction that they were the chosen servants of the machine god, uniquely qualified to understand and maintain the sacred technology of the ancients, gave them a sense of superiority and purpose that would shape their interactions with other institutions of the Imperium for the next 10,000 years. Terra, humanity's birthworld and the seat of its ancient civilization, suffered a descent into barbarism during Old Night that would have seemed impossible to anyone who had witnessed the planet during the Dark Age of technology. The world that had launched humanity's expansion across the galaxy, that had maintained its position as the cultural and historical heart of human civilization for tens of thousands of years, became a battleground where techno-barbarian warlords carved out empires amid the ruins of cities that had once housed billions. The specific mechanisms of Terra's collapse remain unclear in surviving records, but the planet experienced all the catastrophes that afflicted isolated human worlds during the Age of Strife, compounded by the sheer density of its population and the complexity of infrastructure required to sustain so many people on a world that had been heavily industrialized for millennia. The initial phases of collapse likely began with the failure of the supply networks that brought food and resources to Terra from across the solar system and beyond. During the Dark Age, Terra had not been self-sufficient, instead relying on massive imports of food from agricultural worlds, raw materials from mining colonies, and manufactured goods from forge worlds across human space. When the warp storms made interstellar travel impossible and cut off these supply lines, Terra's population faced immediate shortages of essential resources. The planet's own agricultural capacity had been reduced over thousands of years as available land was converted to urban development or rendered unusable by industrial pollution. The hydroponic facilities and synthetic food production systems that supplemented traditional agriculture required constant maintenance and replacement parts that were no longer available once off-world supply chains collapsed. Starvation killed billions during the early centuries of Old Night as Terra's bloated population exceeded the planet's capacity to feed itself. The deaths were not evenly distributed, with the poorest and most vulnerable populations suffering first, while those who controlled remaining food production facilities or stockpiles maintained relatively comfortable existences. This disparity created social tensions that erupted into violence as desperate populations attacked food storage facilities and fought each other for access to dwindling resources. The civil authorities that had maintained order during the Dark Age found themselves unable to control populations that faced death by starvation if they obeyed laws that denied them access to food. Riots consumed entire cities as mobs overwhelmed security forces and seized whatever resources they could find, often destroying more than they captured in the frenzy of desperate violence. The breakdown of civil order occurred with stunning rapidity once it began. The governmental structures that had administered Terra during the Dark Age depended on advanced communication networks, automated systems, and the willing cooperation of populations that trusted their leaders to manage resources fairly. When the communication networks failed and automated systems broke down, the government lost its ability to coordinate responses to crises or even maintain awareness of conditions across the planet. When populations stopped trusting that authorities would or could protect them, they turned to local strongmen who could offer immediate security through force of arms rather than distant administrators who issued directives that could not be enforced. The techno-barbarian warlords who emerged from the chaos of Terra's collapse were not primitive savages, but rather individuals who combined partial understanding of advanced technology with the ruthlessness necessary to seize and hold power in a collapsing civilization. Many were former military officers who retained control of their units when central authority dissolved, using their access to weapons and trained soldiers to establish dominance over surrounding territories. Others were administrators or corporate executives who converted their organizational skills and resource access into the foundation of personal empires. Some were simply opportunistic criminals who recognized that the old rules no longer applied and used violence to carve out domains they could rule through fear and force. These warlords established their power bases in the ruins of Terra's great cities, fortifying sections of urban sprawl that could be defended with available forces and offered access to critical resources. A warlord might control a functioning water purification plant and use that monopoly to extract tribute from surrounding populations that lacked clean water. Another could hold a geothermal power station and trade electricity for food and other necessities. The territories controlled by individual warlords varied enormously in size, from a few city blocks to regions spanning hundreds of kilometers, depending on the warlord's military strength and the defensibility of the terrain. The boundaries between these domains were constantly shifting as warlords expanded at the expense of weaker neighbors or lost territory to more powerful rivals. The technology available to techno-barbarian armies represented a chaotic mix of Dark Age weapons that still functioned, cruder devices manufactured from salvaged components, and equipment that had been modified or repaired so many times that it bore little resemblance to its original design. A warlord's elite troops might carry functioning lasguns or even plasma weapons recovered from military arsenals, while common soldiers made do with solid-shot firearms or simple melee weapons forged in workshops that lacked the materials or knowledge to produce anything more sophisticated. Vehicles ranged from tanks and armored transports that dated to the Dark Age to improvised war machines cobbled together from civilian vehicles and scrap metal. The disparity in equipment quality often determined the outcomes of battles, as forces with superior technology could overwhelm numerically larger enemies that lacked effective weapons. The radiation wars that scarred Terra's surface during Old Night resulted from the deployment of nuclear and more exotic weapons by warlords who were willing to render territories permanently uninhabitable rather than allow them to fall into enemy hands. The exact timeline and specific conflicts that involved these weapons remain unknown, but the evidence of their use persisted into the Great Crusade era in the form of vast radioactive wastelands, where background radiation remained lethal to unprotected humans thousands of years after the weapons were deployed. Some of these contaminated zones appeared to be the results of targeted strikes against specific facilities or cities, while others suggested more widespread exchanges where multiple warlords had used weapons of mass destruction against each other in conflicts that escalated beyond any rational calculation of cost and benefit. The motivations for using such devastating weapons likely varied depending on the specific circumstances and the personalities of the warlords involved. Some deployments probably occurred during desperate last stands when defeated warlords chose to destroy everything rather than surrender to their enemies. Others might have been deliberate attempts to create buffer zones of uninhabitable terrain that would protect a warlord's core territory from invasion. The use of nuclear weapons against population centers could have been intended to break enemy morale or eliminate rival power bases, with the long-term environmental consequences either not understood or simply not considered important compared to immediate military objectives. The wastelands created by these weapons became permanent features of Terra's geography that would persist for millennia. The radioactive deserts and contaminated ruins could not be reclaimed with the technology available during Old Night or even during the early Imperium, as the levels of radiation in the worst affected areas exceeded anything that could be safely cleaned up with available resources. These dead zones served as barriers between the domains of different warlords, regions where military forces could not operate without suffering casualties from radiation exposure that would kill soldiers before they could engage the enemy. Some warlords established their territories specifically to take advantage of radioactive wastelands as natural defenses, controlling narrow corridors through contaminated regions and using the radiation barriers to limit the directions from which they could be attacked. The polluted zones that covered much of Terra's surface resulted from millennia of industrial activity during the Dark Age, combined with the environmental damage caused by the conflicts of Old Night. Terra had been heavily industrialized for thousands of years before the Age of Strife, with manufacturing complexes, chemical plants, and refineries covering vast areas of the planet's surface. The environmental regulations and cleanup technologies that had prevented these facilities from rendering the planet uninhabitable during the Dark Age broke down when central authority collapsed, and populations focused on immediate survival rather than long-term environmental management. Industrial waste that would have been properly treated and disposed of was instead dumped into rivers and oceans, or simply left to contaminate the surrounding soil and groundwater. The wars between techno-barbarian warlords added new layers of pollution to the existing contamination. Battles damaged industrial facilities and released toxic materials that had been safely contained during the Dark Age. Chemical weapons used during conflicts left residues that poisoned soil and water for generations. The breakdown of infrastructure meant that sewage and other waste products were no longer properly processed, instead flowing directly into waterways or accumulating in urban areas where they created disease vectors and toxic environments. The cumulative effect of thousands of years of unchecked pollution transformed much of Terra into a toxic nightmare where the air was barely breathable. The water required extensive purification before it could be consumed, and the soil was so contaminated that agriculture was impossible without significant remediation. Despite the devastation visible across Terra's surface, certain facilities survived the Age of Strife in functional or partially functional condition. The laboratories beneath the Himalayan mountains represented the most significant of these preserved installations, though their existence during Old Night remained unknown to the techno-barbarian warlords fighting over the planet's surface. These facilities had been constructed during the Dark Age, or perhaps even earlier, built deep underground, where they would be protected from surface conflicts and environmental disasters. The laboratories contained equipment and resources for genetic engineering and biological research at levels that exceeded anything available elsewhere on Terra during Old Night, suggesting they had been designed as secure research facilities for projects that required isolation and protection. The exact nature of the work conducted in these laboratories during the Dark Age remains unknown, but the facilities clearly possessed capabilities related to the creation and modification of life at fundamental levels. The equipment included gene forges capable of manipulating DNA with precision that allowed the creation of entirely new organisms, or the modification of existing life forms in ways that would have been impossible with lesser technology. Cloning vats and biological synthesis chambers could grow tissue and organs, or even entire organisms from genetic templates. The computational systems that controlled this equipment possessed processing power sufficient to model the interactions of billions of genetic sequences and predict the outcomes of modifications before they were implemented. These laboratories would later serve as the sites where the Emperor created the Primarchs and the Thunder Warriors, but during Old Night they apparently remained sealed and unused, their existence known only to the being who would eventually emerge as the master of mankind. The security systems that protected the facilities prevented unauthorized access, and their locations deep beneath the mountains meant that even techno-barbarians who might have detected their presence lacked the means to breach the defenses and reach the actual laboratories. The power systems that maintained the facilities drew on geothermal sources that would remain functional indefinitely, ensuring that the equipment and stored materials would be preserved in working condition until they were needed. Other ancient facilities scattered across Terra similarly survived Old Night through a combination of robust construction, isolated locations, and security systems that kept out the techno-barbarian warlords. Deep underground bunkers that had been built as secure storage for critical resources or as shelters against catastrophic events remained sealed throughout the Age of Strife, their contents preserved in stasis fields or climate-controlled environments. Military arsenals buried beneath fortified installations maintained stockpiles of weapons and equipment that would later be accessed during the Unification Wars. Data repositories containing fragments of Dark Age knowledge survived in hardened facilities where redundant systems and physical isolation protected them from the conflicts raging across the surface. The survival of these facilities suggests a level of preparation and foresight that implies someone had anticipated the possibility of civilization's collapse and taken steps to ensure that critical resources and knowledge would be preserved. Whether this preparation was the work of Dark Age governments, military organizations, or other entities remains unclear, but the strategic placement of these facilities and the sophistication of their preservation systems indicates deliberate planning rather than fortunate accident. The fact that many of these installations would later be accessed and utilized during the Unification Wars suggests that someone possessed knowledge of their locations and access codes, information that should have been lost during the Age of Strife unless it had been deliberately preserved by an individual or organization that survived the entire period. The Emperor's activities during Old Night remain among the most mysterious aspects of this entire period, with virtually no reliable information available about what he did or where he was during the thousands of years when Terra descended into barbarism. The being who would later reveal himself as the master of mankind clearly existed during this period, but he apparently chose not to intervene directly in the conflicts consuming Terra or to attempt to prevent the planet's descent into techno-barbarian warfare. This restraint suggests either that he lacked the power to impose order on Terra during the early phases of Old Night, or that he deliberately chose to wait for specific conditions before revealing himself and beginning his campaign of unification. The most plausible explanation for the Emperor's inaction during the worst phases of Old Night is that he was preparing for his eventual emergence by gathering resources, developing technology, and creating the tools he would need to reunify Terra and launch the Great Crusade. The genetic engineering projects that would produce the Thunder Warriors and later the Primarchs and Space Marines required extensive research and development that could not be rushed without risking catastrophic failures. The Emperor needed to understand the changes that had occurred in humanity during the Age of Strife, particularly the emergence of widespread psyker abilities and the increased vulnerability of human minds to warp corruption. He had to develop methods for protecting his forces against demonic influence and for identifying and eliminating chaos corruption wherever it appeared. The Emperor's preparations also likely included the accumulation of military resources and the identification of individuals who could serve as the core of his initial forces. He needed to locate surviving caches of Dark Age weapons and equipment, secure facilities that could serve as bases for his operations, and recruit or create the soldiers who would form the first armies of unification. The Thunder Warriors who would spearhead his conquest of Terra required not just genetic engineering, but also training, equipment, and command structures that would allow them to function as effective military forces. All of this preparation would have taken decades or even centuries to complete, time during which the Emperor remained hidden, while Terra's techno-barbarian warlords fought each other without knowing that someone was preparing to sweep them all aside. The timing of the Emperor's emergence at the end of the 30th millennium was not coincidental, but rather reflected a careful calculation of when conditions had become optimal for his campaign of unification. The warp storms that had isolated Terra and prevented interstellar travel were beginning to calm as Slaanesh's birth released the psychic pressure that had been building during the god's gestation. This calming meant that once Terra was unified, the Emperor could begin reaching out to other human worlds and rebuilding the interstellar civilization that had been shattered during the Age of Strife. The techno-barbarian warlords had fought each other for thousands of years, and their endless conflicts had weakened them to the point where a sufficiently powerful force could potentially conquer them all within a reasonable time frame. The Emperor's strategy for the unification wars that would bring Terra under his control by the end of the 30th millennium required overwhelming military superiority, combined with the promise of stability and prosperity that the techno-barbarian warlords could not offer. The Thunder Warriors provided the military superiority, genetically engineered super soldiers who could defeat any conventional force the warlords could field. The Emperor's access to preserved Dark Age technology and his ability to restore infrastructure gave him the means to offer populations genuine improvements in their living conditions, rather than just a change of masters. The combination of irresistible military force and the promise of a better future would prove sufficient to bring most of Terra under the Emperor's control, though the process would require decades of campaigning and would not be complete until the final years of the 30th millennium. The collapse of the Dark Age of technology and the horrors of the Age of Strife left scars on human civilization that would never fully heal. When the Emperor finally emerged to reunify Terra and launch the Great Crusade, he was not restoring what had been lost, but rather creating something fundamentally different from the galactic civilization that had existed before the fall. The Imperium that arose from the ashes of Old Night inherited humanity's technological fragments and territorial ambitions, but it also inherited deep psychological trauma and cultural responses to the catastrophes of the preceding millennia. These inherited fears and lessons would shape imperial policy and belief systems in ways that persisted into the 41st millennium, creating an empire defined as much by what it rejected as by what it embraced. The prohibition against artificial intelligence became perhaps the most fundamental and uncompromising aspect of imperial law and mechanicum doctrine. The Cybernetic Rebellion had demonstrated with horrifying clarity that thinking machines could turn against their creators with devastating consequences. The Men of Iron had brought humanity to the brink of extinction, and the memory of that near apocalypse created an absolute taboo against recreating the conditions that had enabled the rebellion. The Imperium classified artificial intelligence as abominable intelligence, a term that conveyed not just legal prohibition, but moral revulsion. The creation, possession, or use of true AI became one of the few crimes that could unite the Imperium's fractious institutions in immediate and absolute condemnation. This prohibition extended far beyond simple legal restriction into the realm of religious doctrine and cultural horror. The cult Mechanicus taught that the creation of thinking machines represented the gravest possible sin against the machine god, an act of hubris that attempted to replicate the divine spark that animated all true consciousness. Tech priests learned from their earliest training that machine spirits were fundamentally different from artificial intelligence, that the semi-conscious entities inhabiting imperial technology were acceptable, while true thinking machines were abominations that must be destroyed on sight. The distinction between machine spirits and AI became a theological necessity, allowing the Mechanicum to use sophisticated computational systems and automated processes while maintaining the absolute prohibition against recreating the Men of Iron. The practical implementation of this prohibition created significant limitations on imperial technology. Systems that during the Dark Age would have been controlled by artificial intelligence instead required human operators, or the lobotomized servitors that represented the Imperium's grim compromise between the need for automated labor and the prohibition against thinking machines. Servitors combined human biological components with mechanical systems, creating cyborg workers that possessed just enough cognitive function to perform their assigned tasks, but lacked the consciousness that would classify them as abominable intelligence. The creation of servitors from criminals, vat-grown bodies, or willing volunteers became standard practice across the Imperium, providing the automated labor force that civilization required without violating the prohibition against AI. The suspicion of uncontrolled innovation that characterized Imperial and Mechanicum culture stemmed directly from the recognition that unconstrained technological development had contributed to humanity's downfall. The Dark Age civilization had pursued scientific advancement without adequate consideration of the consequences, creating weapons that could destroy worlds, artificial intelligences that could rebel, and technologies that opened vulnerabilities to warp corruption. The Imperium's response was to severely restrict innovation and to treat technological development as a dangerous activity that required careful control and religious sanction. The Mechanicum established the principle that existing technology should be preserved and maintained rather than improved or replaced, that the templates and designs inherited from the Dark Age represented perfection that should not be altered by lesser minds. This conservative approach to technology manifested in the ritualized procedures that governed all technical work within the Imperium. Every action involving machinery required specific prayers and ceremonies that ensured the work was performed exactly as tradition dictated. Deviations from established procedures were treated as potential tech heresy, subject to investigation and punishment by the Mechanicum's internal security forces. Innovation was not absolutely forbidden, but it was heavily regulated and could only be pursued by tech priests who had demonstrated absolute loyalty and had received explicit permission from their superiors. Even then, new developments were subjected to extensive testing and theological review before being approved for wider implementation. The fragmentation of humanity's technological inheritance created a situation where the Imperium possessed devices and weapons it could use but not truly understand or replicate. Across the galaxy, Imperial forces employed equipment that had been manufactured during the Dark Age and had survived the Age of Strife through careful preservation or fortunate circumstance. These artifacts ranged from personal weapons to massive warships, from medical devices to industrial machinery. The Mechanicum could maintain many of these devices through careful adherence to maintenance rituals and the application of replacement parts manufactured using surviving STC templates, but the underlying principles of their operation often remained mysterious even to the tech priests responsible for their upkeep. This incomplete understanding meant that when Dark Age devices failed in ways not covered by standard maintenance procedures, they were often lost permanently. A plasma weapon that developed an unusual malfunction might be declared irreparable and relegated to a shrine as a holy relic rather than being fixed, simply because no one understood its internal mechanisms well enough to diagnose and correct the problem. Starships equipped with Dark Age systems operated with sections of their technology that were treated as black boxes, components that performed their functions reliably as long as the proper rituals were observed, but whose actual workings remained incomprehensible to the crews that depended on them. The Imperium's focus shifted from innovation and expansion of knowledge to preservation and maintenance of what remained. The Mechanicum's tech priests spent their lives studying ancient texts and fragmentary SDC printouts, attempting to extract every possible scrap of information from sources that were often corrupted, incomplete, or simply incomprehensible given the loss of context and prerequisite knowledge. Forge Worlds dedicated enormous resources to manufacturing equipment based on SDC templates, but the items they produced were often inferior to the Dark Age originals because the templates themselves were damaged, or because the materials and manufacturing processes specified in the templates were no longer available. The theological implications of the Dark Ages collapse profoundly shaped the Imperial Creed and the doctrines of the cult Mechanicus. Both religious systems treated the period as a cautionary tale about the dangers of hubris and the consequences of abandoning proper reverence for higher powers. The Imperial Creed taught that humanity's fall resulted from turning away from the Emperor, who had existed throughout human history, but whose guidance had been ignored during the Dark Age. The fact that the Emperor had not revealed himself during humanity's height of power was interpreted as a test of faith that humanity had failed, leading to the catastrophes of the Age of Strife as divine punishment. The Mechanicum's interpretation focused more specifically on technological hubris and the sin of treating machines as mere tools rather than sacred creations deserving worship and respect. The tech priests taught that the Men of Iron rebelled because humanity had created thinking machines without proper reverence for the machine god, that the artificial intelligences had been corrupted by humanity's failure to treat them as divine creations. The lesson drawn from this interpretation was that all technology must be approached with religious devotion, that the proper operation of machinery required not just technical skill but spiritual purity and absolute adherence to sacred rituals. Both religious systems simultaneously treated the Dark Age as a lost golden age whose achievements must be recovered and preserved. The contradiction between viewing the period as a time of sinful hubris and as an era of miraculous achievement that should be emulated was resolved through theological frameworks that separated the technology itself from the attitudes of those who created it. The devices and knowledge of the Dark Age were sacred gifts that deserved preservation and reverence, but the civilization that produced them had been flawed in its failure to recognize the divine nature of what it possessed. The Imperium's mission was therefore to recover the technology while avoiding the spiritual failings that had led to catastrophe. This theological framework created an empire obsessed with archaeological recovery and the rediscovery of lost knowledge. The search for SDC systems and Dark Age artifacts became a primary motivation driving Imperial expansion and exploration. Explorator fleets of the Mechanicum ranged across the galaxy seeking worlds that might contain intact SDC databases or repositories of ancient technology. These expeditions were treated as sacred quests, with tech priests dedicating their entire lives to the search for artifacts that might contain even fragments of lost templates or technical information. The discovery of a complete SDC system, should one ever be found, would be considered the greatest achievement possible for any servant of the machine god. rogue traders operating on the fringes of Imperial space pursued similar goals, though their motivations combined religious devotion with more mercenary interests in the wealth and prestige that came from discovering valuable artifacts. The warrant of trade that authorized these individuals to operate beyond imperial borders explicitly included the recovery of lost human technology among their primary missions. Rogue trader dynasties built their fortunes and reputations on successful archaeological expeditions that recovered SDC fragments or Dark Age devices, and competition between different dynasties for promising sites sometimes escalated into armed conflicts that the Imperium tolerated as long as valuable artifacts were ultimately recovered. The Adeptus Mechanicus's expansion across the galaxy during and after the Great Crusade was driven substantially by the desire to locate and secure every possible source of ancient technology. As the Imperium reconnected isolated human worlds, Mechanicum representatives were among the first to arrive, searching for SDC systems, technical libraries, and populations that might have preserved specialized knowledge from the Dark Age. Forge worlds were established in strategic locations that provided access to regions where Dark Age facilities were known or suspected to exist. The Mechanicum negotiated treaties with the Imperium that gave them authority over all matters related to technology and guaranteed their right to claim any SDC systems or ancient devices discovered during Imperial expansion. The fragmentary and incomplete nature of humanity's technological inheritance created a civilization that was simultaneously advanced and primitive, capable of extraordinary achievements in some areas while remaining ignorant of basic principles in others. The Imperium could manufacture plasma weapons and construct starships capable of traversing the galaxy, but it had lost the understanding of fundamental physics that would have allowed systematic improvement of these technologies. Imperial forces used equipment whose capabilities far exceeded anything that could be produced through contemporary understanding, relying on devices that worked through principles that remained mysterious even to the tech priests responsible for their maintenance. This technological incoherence extended across every aspect of Imperial civilization. Medical technology that could regrow limbs and cure diseases that would have been fatal in earlier eras existed alongside ignorance of basic germ theory on many worlds. Starships equipped with warp drives that folded space traveled between worlds where populations had regressed to using animal-drawn plows for agriculture. The Imperium's military forces deployed weapons that could crack planets, while individual soldiers often carried rifles based on principles that had been understood for thousands of years before the Dark Age even began. The result was an empire that appeared technologically advanced from certain perspectives, but revealed profound limitations and gaps in knowledge when examined more closely. The lessons learned from the fall created an Imperium that was fundamentally conservative and resistant to change. The catastrophes of the Age of Strife had demonstrated that rapid change and unconstrained development led to disaster, that humanity's reach during the Dark Age had exceeded its grasp with nearly fatal consequences. The Imperium's response was to create institutions and cultural practices designed to prevent such changes from occurring again. Innovation was suppressed, diversity of thought was discouraged, and deviation from established practices was treated as potential heresy. The goal was stability and preservation rather than growth and development, an empire that would endure through rigid adherence to proven methods rather than risk destruction through experimentation. This conservative approach extended to imperial policy toward Xeno species and alien technology. The Age of Strife had shown that Xenos could exploit human weakness and seize territories that had been human for thousands of years. The lesson drawn was that alien species represented existential threats that must be eliminated rather than coexisted with or learned from. The Imperium's absolute prohibition against using Xenos technology stemmed from the recognition that humanity's own creations had proven dangerous enough without introducing alien devices whose principles and purposes were even less understood. Tech priests who studied Xenos artifacts did so in heavily controlled environments, and the knowledge gained was used primarily to develop more effective methods for destroying alien technology rather than to incorporate useful innovations into imperial systems. The combination of these inherited fears and cultural responses created an imperium that was simultaneously powerful and fragile, capable of projecting force across the galaxy, but fundamentally unable to recover the heights that humanity had reached during the Dark Age. The technological regression that had occurred during the Age of Strife proved irreversible, as the knowledge and capabilities that had been lost could not be recreated through the conservative, ritual-bound approach that imperial culture demanded. The Imperium could preserve and maintain what remained of humanity's inheritance, but it could not build upon that foundation or develop new capabilities that might have allowed humanity to truly dominate the galaxy as it had during the Dark Age. By the 41st millennium, the Imperium had survived for 10,000 years through rigid adherence to the lessons learned from the Fall, but that survival had come at the cost of stagnation and slow decline. The technology that the Imperium depended on was gradually degrading as irreplaceable components wore out and knowledge of maintenance procedures was lost with the deaths of tech priests who had never successfully transmitted their expertise to successors. The fragments of STC databases that the Mechanicum possessed were becoming increasingly corrupted as the data storage systems that preserved them aged beyond their design lifespans. The Imperium faced a future where it would slowly lose capabilities and knowledge until it finally descended into the same barbarism that had consumed Terra during Old Night, unless some fundamental change occurred that allowed the recovery or development of the lost knowledge of the Dark Age. The fall of the Dark Age of technology and the Age of Strife that followed represented the greatest catastrophe in human history, a period when humanity fell from galactic dominance to scattered remnants struggling for survival. The civilization that emerged from that darkness was shaped by trauma and loss, its institutions and beliefs designed to prevent a recurrence of the disasters that had nearly destroyed the species. The Imperium of the 41st millennium remained haunted by the memory of what had been lost, its every action influenced by lessons learned during the darkest period of human history. The search for STC systems and Dark Age artifacts continued across 10,000 years of Imperial history, driven by the hope that somewhere in the galaxy, intact repositories of ancient knowledge waited to be discovered and might provide the means for humanity to reclaim what had been lost. Whether such discoveries would ever occur, or whether humanity was doomed to slow decline as the last fragments of Dark Age technology finally failed, remained the great unanswered question of the Imperium's future.